The desert night smelled like dust and creosote and something bitter that might have been regret. Margaret Brennan stood in the darkness outside the sprawling house at the end of the cul-de-sac, her right hand resting on the cold weight in her jacket pocket. The gun felt heavier than she remembered, though it had been 20 years since she'd held one. 20 years since Bobby had taught her to shoot tin cans off fence posts behind their farmhouse in Tennessee. His patient voice in her ear, his steady hand on her shoulder. That house was gone now, sold to strangers while she sat in a prison cell, convicted of a murder she didn't commit. The man who taught her to shoot was dead, buried without her beside him. And the woman who took everything, her own sister, was dying behind those floor-to-ceiling windows, surrounded by wealth built on blood and lies. Maggie's finger traced the trigger guard through the fabric. Not yet. First, she needed to hear Sarah say it, needed to look into those pale blue eyes and understand why. 20 years she'd waited for this moment. She could wait 5 minutes more. The decision made, she stepped back into shadow, let her hand fall away from the gun. The night swallowed her whole. 1 year earlier, the sky had looked different, paler, filtered through razor wire and chain link, reduced to a rectangle of freedom she could see but never touch. March 14th, 2026. A Friday morning, cold enough to see breath crystallize in the Tennessee air. The gates of Deborah K. Rehabilitation Center for Women opened at 6:47 a.m., and Margaret Brennan walked through them carrying everything she owned in a clear plastic bag that weighed less than her coat. $47 in small bills. A photograph of Bobby at 35, before the heart disease that would kill him 15 years later. A wooden cross worn smooth by decades of anxious fingers. 20 years reduced to objects that barely filled two hands. The security guard who processed her release looked at her the way people look at ghosts, something that shouldn't still be walking around, something that belonged to a different time. He handed her a bus voucher to Nashville without meeting her eyes. Outside, the parking lot held 3 cars and no one waiting. She'd known that before she walked out. There was no one left to wait. Bobby had died in 2011, his heart giving out in a hospital room, while she sat in a visiting area 200 miles away, waiting for a phone call that never came. Her parents had passed years before her conviction. Friends drifted when newspapers printed your face beside words like conspiracy and cold-blooded and calculated. People don't hold space in their lives for killers, even ones who swear they're innocent. Only Sarah should have been there. Sarah who'd promised with her hand on their mother's grave to protect everything. Sarah who'd made that promise and then disappeared like smoke, like she'd never existed at all. The bus to Grover's Mill left at 8:30. Maggie sat in the station on a plastic chair bolted to the floor and watched people move through their ordinary mornings. A mother bought her daughter hot chocolate from a vending machine. 2 construction workers argued about a football game. A teenager slept against his backpack, earbuds dangling. All of them free to walk away, free to choose where they went next, free in ways Maggie was still learning to understand. At 72, her body had become a stranger. Arthritis lived in both knees now, a constant reminder with every step. Her hands shook sometimes for no reason the doctors could name. The thick, dark hair she'd been proud of had thinned to gray wisps she kept short because it was easier, because vanity felt like a luxury from another life. The woman in the bathroom mirror looked decades older than the one who'd been arrested at 52. Maggie had stopped trying to find her younger self in those tired eyes. The bus ride took 3 hours through countryside that had changed more than she'd expected. Strip malls stood where she remembered farmland. Housing developments sprawled across hills that used to grow tobacco. Even the highway seemed different, wider, newer, marked with signs for businesses that hadn't existed when she went in. She pressed her face to the window and watched Tennessee roll past like a documentary about someone else's home. Grover's Mill appeared through the trees just after noon. Population 4,300, close enough to Nashville for commuters, but far enough to feel separate, slower, like time moved at a different speed. Maggie knew every street in this town. She'd taught high school English here for 18 years. She'd bought groceries at Miller's Market every Thursday. She'd walked these sidewalks with Bobby on Sunday mornings after church, his hand warm in hers, solid proof that goodness existed in the world. The bus dropped her at the gas station on Main Street. Same location, but painted different colors now, with new pumps and a convenience store that looked nothing like the old garage. Maggie stood on the cracked pavement and let the sun touch her face. Real sunlight, Not the pale, filtered version that made it through razor wire and chain link. Real warmth without anyone watching, without anyone counting the minutes she could stand outside. Miller Road ran 2 miles east of downtown, cutting through what used to be farmland before developers discovered Grover's Mill in the 90s. Maggie walked because she had no car, no phone to call a taxi, even if she'd had money for one. Her knees protested every step, but she pushed through it. Pain was temporary. This moment, this walk home after 20 years, this only happened once. The house appeared exactly where memory promised it would. White two-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch, sitting on 3 acres of land that had been her grandmother's, then her mother's, then hers. The oak tree in the front yard had grown taller, its branches spreading wider than she remembered. The porch had been painted recently, crisp white that caught the afternoon light. Someone had added flower boxes to the windows, spilling over with petunias and ivy. Then she saw the minivan in the driveway. Dark blue, newer model, car seats visible through the rear window. Toys scattered across the front lawn. A plastic slide, a tricycle lying on its side, a sandbox with a bright yellow cover. The mailbox at the road said Morrison in neat black letters. Maggie stopped at the edge of the property. Her heart hammered against her ribs too fast, the irregular rhythm her doctor in prison had warned her about. This is my house. The words formed in her mind but wouldn't reach her mouth. This is my house, my grandmother's house. My mother left it to me. This is mine. The front door opened. A woman stepped onto the porch. Young, maybe mid-30s, with auburn hair pulled into a messy bun and a pregnant belly that suggested 7 or 8 months. She wore yoga pants and an oversized sweater, one hand resting on her stomach in the unconscious gesture of women carrying life inside them. Her expression shifted from casual curiosity to concern as she took in Maggie's appearance. The prison issue clothes, the plastic bag, the bewildered look of someone who just discovered their entire world had been stolen. "Can I help you?" The woman's voice carried across the yard, gentle and cautious. Maggie's mouth opened, closed. The words tangled somewhere between her brain and her tongue. She grabbed the mailbox to keep from falling, her knuckles white against the wooden post. "This is my house." The woman's face went pale. She descended the porch steps slowly, protective hands still on her belly, moving like someone approaching an injured animal. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. My husband and I have lived here for 16 years. 16 years. Sarah had sold the house 16 years ago, 4 years after Maggie went to prison, while Maggie still believed her sister was maintaining it, protecting it, keeping their mother's legacy safe. 16 years of strangers living in rooms where Maggie had grown up, where she'd learned to read, where Bobby had built furniture in the workshop out back, where her mother had died surrounded by photographs of daughters who were supposed to love each other. My name is Margaret Brennan. This is my house. My grandmother Eleanor left it to my mother. My mother left it to me when she died in 1995. I've been in prison. I just got out this morning. My sister was supposed to. Recognition flashed across the woman's face. Not pleasant recognition. The kind that comes from reading newspaper articles about murder trials, from hearing a name associated with words like guilty and life sentence, and finally released. "Oh God, you're Clare Brennan's sister. She said you were dead." The world tilted sideways. Maggie's grip on the mailbox tightened until splinters bit into her palm. "What?" "Clare Brennan. She sold us this house in 2009. She said it was her family's property, that her parents had passed away and her sister had died. She seemed so sad about it, like she couldn't bear to keep the house with all the memories. She had paperwork, death certificate, probate documents, everything. Our lawyer checked. The title was clear. The sale was legal. Legal. Maggie's brain caught on that word and held it. Legal meant papers and signatures in systems that should prevent this exact scenario, that should protect someone's property while they sat in a cell paying for a crime they didn't commit. Legal meant her sister had done more than just abandon her. Sarah had erased her, declared her dead, sold her home, stolen her entire existence, and made it look legitimate. I wasn't dead. I was in prison for 20 years. This house is mine. My sister had no right to sell it. The woman's hand moved to her mouth. Behind her, the door opened again and a man appeared. Tall, lean, early 30s, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples and sharp eyes that assessed situations for a living. He took one look at his wife's expression and moved down the steps to stand beside her, close enough to intervene if needed, but not crowding. "Kate, what's going on?" "This is Margaret Brennan," the woman Claire said was dead. The man's posture shifted slightly, not quite defensive, but ready. His eyes moved from Maggie's face to the plastic bag to her worn shoes and back. Whatever he saw there made his shoulders relax a fraction. "I think you should come inside. I think we need to talk." Inside, the house looked nothing like Maggie remembered. The new owners had knocked down the wall between the kitchen and dining room, creating an open space with modern cabinets and granite countertops. The hardwood floors Bobby had refinished in 1998 were still there, but covered now with colorful rugs and scattered toys. Family photos lined the mantel where Maggie's mother's china cabinet used to stand. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator. This was a home, warm and lived in and loved, just not her home anymore. The woman made tea while the man, he'd introduced himself as Daniel Morrison, moved toys off the couch so Maggie could sit. They didn't treat her like a criminal. They treated her like someone who'd suffered something incomprehensible, which Maggie supposed was closer to the truth. Kate brought 3 mugs to the coffee table and lowered herself carefully into an armchair, one hand supporting her back. "I don't know what to say. When we bought this house, everything seemed legitimate. Claire had all the documentation. She was so convincing." Dan leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His voice carried the weight of professional experience, someone who'd spent years learning to recognize patterns others missed. "What I do for a living, I investigate insurance fraud. I've done it for 15 years. You learn to spot when something's too clean, when the paperwork's too perfect, when someone's worked very hard to make sure there are no questions." "Are you saying Claire committed fraud?" "I'm saying when Kate told me about meeting you, I went back through our purchase documents. And yes, I'm saying there are red flags I should have caught 16 years ago when I was younger and less suspicious." Maggie's hands wrapped around the mug, but she didn't drink. The warmth seeped into her palms, real and immediate, grounding her to this moment in this kitchen that used to be hers. "Sarah was my sister, my little sister. I raised her after our parents died. I helped her through 2 divorces. I lent her money. I let her cry in my kitchen at 2 in the morning. When I was arrested, she promised to take care of everything. The house, my savings, Bobby's workshop. She swore on our mother's grave she'd keep it all safe until I got out." Kate's eyes glistened. "How much did you have saved?" $180,000 in a safe in the basement. "Bobby and I saved for 30 years. We couldn't have children. We were going to travel when he retired, see all the places we'd only read about. After he died, I kept it there. Emergency money, money for property taxes while I was away." Sarah knew the combination. She was supposed to use it to maintain the house. Dan stood abruptly, paced to the window, came back. The energy in his body suggested someone working very hard to control anger. "There's no safe in the basement. We've been down there hundreds of times. Storage and the furnace. That's all." She took it. Maggie's voice came out flat, empty of surprise. Of course Sarah had taken it. Sarah had taken everything else. Why leave $180,000 sitting there when she could have it, spend it, make it disappear along with Maggie's home and future, and any possibility of starting over? How much did she sell the house for? $215,000. Market value at the time. Maggie did the math in her head. $215,000 for the house. $180,000 from the safe. Bobby's workshop equipment and handmade furniture would have brought at least $10,000 or $12,000 at auction. All their furniture, their mother's china, family heirlooms, another $20,000 or $30,000 easy. Sarah had liquidated Maggie's entire life and walked away with close to $500,000. "I need to find her. I need to understand why she did this." Dan exchanged a look with Kate, some silent communication that passed between people who'd been together long enough to develop their own language. Kate nodded almost imperceptibly. "You can stay here tonight, in the guest room. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps. But Margaret, you should know something. You're not the first person who's come looking for answers about what happened here." Before Maggie could ask what that meant, footsteps thundered on the stairs and a girl appeared in the doorway. 9 or 10 years old, blonde hair in braids, freckles across her nose, skinny legs and grass-stained jeans. She skidded to a stop when she saw Maggie, eyes going wide with the unfiltered curiosity of children who hadn't yet learned to hide what they felt. "Mom, who's this?" "Emma, this is Miss Margaret. She's going to stay with us for a little while." Emma studied Maggie with unnerving directness. Are you sad? You look sad. Something about the blunt honesty of it broke through Maggie's careful control. Tears welled up before she could stop them, hot and unexpected, the first she'd cried since walking out of prison. She'd made it through the bus ride, the walk, the discovery of strangers in her home, all without crying. But a 9-year-old girl's simple observation shattered whatever wall she'd built around her feelings. Yes, sweetheart, I am very sad. Emma nodded like this made perfect sense. That's okay. Mom says it's good to cry when you're sad. It helps the sad come out so there's room for happy later. Kate guided Emma toward the kitchen with gentle hands. Why don't you go finish your homework? We'll call you for dinner in an hour. After Emma left, the three adults sat in silence that felt less awkward than it should have. Maggie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, embarrassed but also strangely relieved. These people didn't know her. They owed her nothing. But they'd invited her into their home, offered her tea and a place to sleep, treated her like a human being instead of a convicted murderer or an inconvenient problem. Why are you being kind to me? You don't know me. For all you know, I really did kill someone. Dan's response came without hesitation. Did you? No. Then that's all I need to know. That night, Maggie lay in what had been her sewing room, now converted to a guest bedroom with pale blue walls and a comfortable bed that felt impossibly soft after 20 years of prison mattresses. She stared at the ceiling and thought about Sarah, her baby sister, the girl she'd taught to ride a bicycle, the teenager she'd consoled through heartbreak, the young woman who'd called her at 2 in the morning, desperate and scared, needing someone to believe her story about gambling debts and loan sharks and dangerous men. Maggie had believed. She'd taken the flash drive Sarah gave her, hidden it in her house, promised to go to the authorities if anything happened to Sarah. She'd been so focused on protecting her sister that she never questioned whether the threat was real, never asked to see proof, never wondered why Sarah came to her instead of the police. 3 weeks later, Victor Castellano was dead, shot twice in his home office while his wife attended a charity gala with 200 witnesses. The police found detailed plans on a flash drive in Maggie's bedroom, plans written in what looked like Maggie's handwriting, plans that included Victor's security schedule, the layout of his house, instructions for a man named Curtis Webb, who lived 3 counties away and had a record for assault. Maggie had never met Curtis Webb, never been to Victor Castellano's house, never written those plans, but her fingerprints were on the flash drive. $8,000 withdrawn from her savings account matched the serial numbers of bills found in Curtis Webb's trailer. And Sarah, sweet Sarah, who'd begged for help, sat on the witness stand and told the jury how Maggie had manipulated her, how Maggie had a grudge against Victor for foreclosing on a friend's property years ago, how Maggie had threatened to hurt Sarah if she didn't help. The jury believed Sarah. Juries usually believe the crying sister, the one who seemed devastated by what she had to do, who apologized to Maggie even as she destroyed her life. They believed Sarah because she was convincing, because she'd always been convincing. Their mother used to say Sarah could charm birds out of trees. Maggie hadn't understood then. Even sitting at the defense table listening to her sister lie, part of her had thought it was a mistake, a misunderstanding, something that would get cleared up once people knew the whole truth. 20 years later, staring at a ceiling in what used to be her house, Maggie finally understood. There was no mistake. Sarah had planned every detail, the gambling debt story, the flash drive, the forged handwriting, the money transfers, every piece designed to create a perfect frame, a story so airtight the jury wouldn't hesitate. But why? That question kept Maggie awake until dawn painted the sky pink outside the window. Why would her own sister destroy her? What had Maggie done to deserve 20 years in prison, her husband dying alone, her home sold to strangers, every piece of her existence erased? Morning brought Dan to the guest room door with coffee and news that someone was downstairs asking for Maggie. An old man. A 9-year-old man, Dan said, claimed to be a friend. Maggie went downstairs and borrowed clothes, Kate's sweatpants and t-shirt, too big but clean and comfortable. The old man waiting in the living room was someone she recognized instantly despite the 20 years that had carved new lines in his face. Judge Henry Caldwell stood when she entered, taller than she remembered, but stooped now with age, his thick hair gone completely white. 78 if Maggie calculated right. Retired 6 years ago according to courthouse gossip she'd heard from other inmates. He'd been 58 when he presided over her trial, still young enough to climb the judicial ladder, old enough to command respect in the courtroom. Mrs. Brennan, I wasn't sure I'd find you here. Judge Caldwell. Maggie's voice came out steadier than she felt. Just call me Maggie. Just Henry now. I gave up the gavel in 2015. Gave up a lot of things, actually. Peace of mind, mostly. Restful sleep. The ability to look at myself in the mirror without wondering if I'd failed someone who deserved better. Maggie sat on the couch, her hands finding the cross in her pocket, worry beads that had survived 2 decades. You did your job. You presided over the trial. The jury made their decision. And I've regretted letting that jury make that decision every day since. I saw something was wrong. I felt it. The way your sister testified. Too perfect. Too rehearsed. The evidence that fit together too neatly, like someone had worked very hard to make sure there were no loose ends. But I couldn't intervene. The law is very clear about what a judge can and cannot do during a trial. Dan brought more coffee, then retreated to the kitchen, giving them privacy while staying close enough to hear. Maggie appreciated that. The protection without intrusion. Why are you here, Henry? Because I kept your case file. Because I've reviewed it every year on the anniversary of your sentencing. Because 2 years ago I found something that didn't sit right and I started digging. And because yesterday I saw a news report about early releases from the women's facility, and I hoped, maybe you'd be on that list. He pulled papers from a worn briefcase, spread them on the coffee table. Court documents, financial records, photographs. Maggie recognized some of them from her trial. Others were new. I can't give you back 20 years. I can't bring back your husband or restore your home. But I can help you prove your sister framed you. And more than that, I can help you understand why. Maggie's pulse quickened. Her hands tightened on the cross until the edges bit into her palm. You know why? I have theories. Strong theories backed by evidence that wasn't available during your trial. But to prove them, we need to find Sarah. Do you know where she is? No, I haven't heard from her in, Maggie counted back, 17 years. She visited once, 3 months after the conviction. Said she was sorry it had to be this way. Said she'd take care of everything. Then she vanished. Henry nodded like this confirmed something he'd suspected. Did she say anything else? Anything that seemed odd at the time? Maggie closed her eyes, reaching back through years of memory to that visiting room, to Sarah sitting across the table in a black dress, tissues clutched in her hand, tears that seemed real but probably weren't. She said it was me or her. I asked what she meant, but she wouldn't explain. She just kept apologizing and promising to make things right when I got out. It was me or her. Henry wrote this down in careful script. That fits? That fits very well with what I found. Before he could explain, the front door opened and a young woman entered carrying a briefcase that looked too heavy for her small frame. She couldn't have been more than 30, with dark hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. When she saw Maggie, her entire face lit up with something that looked like hope mixed with righteous anger. You must be Margaret Brennan. I'm Rachel Porter. Everyone calls me Rachel. Tennessee Innocence Project. Judge Caldwell asked me to come by this morning. Rachel Porter didn't waste time with pleasantries. She sat on the floor, spread more documents across the coffee table, and launched into a presentation that felt practiced but passionate. She'd been with the Innocence Project for 3 years, she explained, specialized in cases where the original investigation showed signs of tunnel vision, where investigators had a suspect and built the case around that person instead of following evidence objectively. Your case is a textbook example. Rachel pointed to the timeline of the investigation. 3 days between Victor Castellano's murder and your arrest. 3 days to find a flash drive in your bedroom, trace money to Curtis Webb, connect you to the victim through a foreclosure that had happened 9 years earlier. That's incredibly fast. Most murder investigations take weeks or months to build a solid case. Either the police were extraordinarily efficient, which their track record suggests they weren't, or someone handed them everything they needed. Someone who knew exactly where the flash drive was hidden. Dan had moved to lean against the doorframe, arms crossed, listening with the intensity of someone who understood investigation from the inside. Someone who knew about the money transfers because she'd made them. Someone who could cry convincingly and tell a story the police wanted to believe. You're saying Sarah set up the police to find specific evidence? I'm saying Sarah built a perfect frame and then told the police exactly where to look. She played victim, convinced investigator, and star witness all at once. And it worked because you fit a profile they were already primed to believe. Older sister with financial problems. History of bailing Sarah out. Possible resentment over Victor Castellano foreclosing on a friend's property. Maggie blinked. I didn't have financial problems. Bobby and I were comfortable, and I wasn't resentful about the foreclosure. The friend was Sarah. Victor foreclosed on a property Sarah was renting after she fell behind on payments. I felt bad for her, but I wasn't angry at Victor. I barely knew the man. Rachel and Henry exchanged looks that said this confirms something they had already suspected. Did Sarah tell the police you were angry? Maggie's voice came out smaller than she intended. She told them I blamed Victor for Sarah's financial ruin. Said I'd mentioned him multiple times, always negatively. Said I'd talked about how men like Victor destroyed regular people's lives without consequences. Lies. All lies. Maggie had never said any of that. She'd never thought it. But 12 people on a jury had believed Sarah's version instead of Maggie's. And Maggie had lost 20 years trying to understand how that happened. Dan pushed off the doorframe, paced to the window. I've been running financial searches since yesterday. I can't find any accounts under Sarah Brennan in Tennessee. Rachel pulled out her phone, tapped rapidly. She wouldn't use her real name. Not after what she did. Have you tried variants? Maiden names, married names, any aliases? I've tried everything I can think of, but I'm hitting walls. Bank privacy laws, jurisdictional boundaries. I need either more specific information or a legal warrant, which I can't get without probable cause. Rachel's frustration showed in the tight line of her jaw. We're in a catch-22. We need evidence to get warrants to get evidence. Henry had been quiet, watching this exchange with the patience of someone who'd spent decades in courtrooms on learning when to speak and when to listen. Now he leaned forward, hands clasped on the table. Margaret, I need to ask you something. Did your sister have access to your financial accounts? She had power of attorney. Bobby had a heart attack in 2004, and I was terrified something would happen to both of us. I wanted someone who could access our accounts if needed. Sarah was family. I trusted her. The room went silent, except for the ticking of a clock on the mantel. Rachel closed her eyes. Dan cursed softly. Henry nodded like Maggie had just confirmed his worst theory. Power of attorney means she could withdraw funds, make transfers, basically do anything you could do with your own money. The $8,000 that ended up in Curtis Webb's trailer, she took it from your account using legal authorization you gave her. The implications crashed over Maggie in waves. Sarah hadn't just framed her. Sarah had used legal documents Maggie had signed out of love and trust to build the frame. Every piece of evidence against Maggie had a source, and that source was always something legitimate Maggie had done for innocent reasons. The flash drive was hidden in Maggie's house because Sarah had access to her house. The money came from Maggie's account because Maggie had given Sarah legal access. The handwriting looked like Maggie's because Sarah had years of birthday cards and letters to practice from. She planned this for years. Rachel's voice was gentle but firm. I think she planned it for as long as it took to find the right opportunity. Victor Castellano was that opportunity. Emma appeared in the doorway, curious about the gathering of serious adults in her living room. She carried a wooden box, old and battered, with brass hinges gone dark with age. I found this in the attic. It has writing on it. See? Emma held up the box, carved into the lid in careful letters. Maggie's things. Maggie's breath caught. She reached for the box with trembling hands. Emma gave it over willingly, then settled cross-legged on the floor to watch with the rapt attention of someone witnessing something important. Inside the box lay fragments of Maggie's old life. A USB drive she didn't recognize. A spiral notebook filled with handwriting that wasn't hers. Photographs of Maggie and Bobby from their wedding, from Christmases past, from the life they'd built together. Christmas cards Maggie had sent Sarah over the years, all carefully saved. And underneath everything, a letter in an envelope addressed to whoever finds this. Maggie opened the envelope. The letter inside was dated January 2009. Written in Sarah's flowing script, always prettier than Maggie's, more carefully formed. If anyone reads this, I want you to know I did what I had to do. Maggie had everything. The house, the husband, the respect, the love. I had nothing. When Mother died, she gave Maggie a fortune and gave me scraps. $200,000 in property to Maggie, $23,000 in insurance to me. I spent years trying to make something of myself while Maggie lived in comfort in the house that should have been partly mine. Victor was supposed to be my way out. We had plans, real plans. Then his wife found out and he chose his money over me. He deserved what happened. And Maggie was always so trusting, so willing to believe I needed her help. Using her was easy, necessary. I'm not sorry. The money from Victor's insurance, the money from selling Maggie's house and taking her savings, all of it is mine now. I'm moving to Arizona to start over. By the time anyone finds this, I'll be someone else. Someone who didn't have to watch her sister get everything while she got nothing. This is justice. My justice. Maggie took 20 years from me by being the favorite, by getting everything I deserved. Now she can give me 20 years back. The letter fell from Maggie's hands. The room spun. Dan caught her before she fell, guided her back to the couch, his voice distant through the roaring in her ears. Sarah had written a confession, left it in a box in the attic of the house she'd sold. A confession she must have thought would never be found, or would be found too late to matter. A confession that laid out her motives with chilling clarity. Jealousy over an inheritance, rage at being second best, willingness to destroy her sister for money and spite. Rachel had the letter now, reading it with widening eyes, her hands careful with the paper like it might dissolve if handled too roughly. This is a confession. This is admissible evidence, Margaret. This changes everything. We can petition for exoneration immediately. With this letter and what we found about the insurance fraud, we can prove you were framed. But Maggie barely heard her. She was stuck on one line. By the time anyone finds this, I'll be someone else. Someone else. Sarah had planned to disappear, to shed her identity like a snake shedding skin, to become someone new in Arizona where no one knew her history. Someone new who didn't have a sister in prison, who didn't have murder in her past, who could start over with blood money and a clean slate. We need to find her before she's too far gone to find. Dan was already moving, phone in hand, fingers flying across the screen. Arizona is a big state, but we have parameters. Woman, late 60s now, probably living comfortably given the money she stole. Name change, but personality probably consistent. She'll be charming, convincing, maybe attached to another wealthy man. Henry stood, gathering his briefcase. I have a friend who specializes in tracking people who don't want to be found. Former FBI, now works private contracts. If Sarah's in Arizona living under an assumed name, Boone McKenzie will find her. How long will it take? Depends on how well she's hidden. Could be days, could be weeks. But he'll find her. Rachel packed documents into her briefcase, already mentally constructing legal arguments Maggie could hear in the set of her shoulders. I'm filing the petition for exoneration Monday morning. Henry, I'll need your statement about the irregularities you noticed. Dan, anything you can document about the financial fraud. And Margaret, I'll need you to write down everything you remember about the flash drive, the night Sarah came to you, every detail of her testimony that contradicted what you knew to be true. Maggie nodded numbly. Writing it down meant reliving it, meant walking back through the worst moments of her life with fresh eyes and the knowledge that every word her sister spoke had been carefully crafted to destroy her. But if that's what it took to clear her name, to prove she'd spent 20 years in prison for someone else's crime, she'd do it. Kate touched Maggie's arm gently. You should rest. This is a lot to take in. I can't rest. Not until I know where she is. Not until I can look her in the eye and ask her how she slept at night knowing what she'd done. Then let us work while you rest. You've carried this alone for 20 years. Let someone else carry it for a few hours. The kindness broke something in Maggie's chest. She'd been so focused on surviving, on making it through each day in prison without letting the injustice consume her, that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have people on her side. People who believed her. People who wanted to help, not because they owed her something, but because it was right. That night, Maggie slept fitfully, dreams full of Sarah's face, Sarah's voice, Sarah's hands signing away Maggie's life with a smile. She woke at 3 a.m. to find Emma sitting cross-legged at the foot of the bed, watching her with solemn eyes. Did I wake you, sweetheart? No, I heard you crying. Mom says sometimes when people are really sad, it helps to have someone nearby. So I came to sit with you. Maggie patted the bed beside her. Emma scrambled up, settled against the headboard, small and warm and uncomplicated in the way only children can be. Miss Margaret, if your sister says she's sorry, would you forgive her? The question was impossibly complex, made simple by a child's directness. Would she forgive Sarah? Could she forgive 20 years, a dead husband, a stolen home? A life erased? Could she forgive being used, betrayed, discarded like something disposable? I don't know, honey. I need to hear her explain first. I need to understand why she thought what she did was okay. And then I don't know. Emma nodded like this made perfect sense. Okay, that's good. Mom says you can't forgive someone if you don't understand what you're forgiving them for. Your mom sounds very wise. She is. She's the wisest person I know. Well, her and Dad, they're both pretty wise. Maggie smiled despite everything, despite the weight crushing her chest and the anger burning in her gut. This child, this stranger's child in Maggie's former house, had become a small, bright point in the darkness. A reminder that good people still existed, that kindness still mattered, that not everyone was a Sarah. Morning brought news that would change everything. Henry called at 7, voice tight with controlled excitement. Boone Mackenzie had found a lead. A woman matching Sarah's description, living in Scottsdale under the name Diana Whitfield, married to a retired surgeon named Marcus Whitfield, living in a gated community called Desert Crown Estates. DMV records showed a woman 67 years old with Sarah's birth date. Property records showed the Whitfields had lived there for 6 years. But there was more. Medical records Boone had accessed through channels Henry didn't explain showed Diana Whitfield had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. Stage 3. Prognosis 4 to 6 months. Sarah was dying. Maggie stood in the Morrison kitchen, holding the phone to her ear, listening to Henry explain treatment timelines and hospice options, and the probability that Sarah wouldn't survive to see Christmas. The anger that had sustained her through the night drained away, replaced by something more complicated. Her sister was dying. The woman who destroyed her life would be dead soon, beyond reach of justice or questions or the reckoning Maggie had imagined for 20 years. We need to go now, before she's too sick to talk, before she dies and takes her answers with her. Henry agreed. Rachel could file the exoneration petition from Nashville, but for Maggie to get the answers she needed, for any of them to truly understand why Sarah had done what she did, they needed to confront her face to face. Kate offered to go with them. Dan insisted on it, his investigator's instincts unwilling to let Maggie face Sarah alone. Henry had already booked flights for that afternoon. Nashville to Phoenix, rental car to Scottsdale. They'd arrive by evening. Maggie packed the few belongings she owned back into the plastic bag, added the letter Sarah had written, the confession that would set her free legally even if it couldn't give her back what she'd lost. Kate lent her clothes for the trip, real clothes that fit better than prison issue, that made Maggie look less like a convict and more like a woman who deserved to be taken seriously. At noon, Emma hugged Maggie goodbye with fierce intensity. Bring back answers, okay? And then come back here. You shouldn't be alone after you get answers to sad questions. Maggie promised. She meant it. These people, the Morrisons who owed her nothing and gave her everything, Henry who carried guilt for a trial he couldn't change, Rachel who fought for justice even when it came 20 years late, they'd become something like family in 2 days. Not the family Maggie had been born into, the family that had betrayed her, but the family you choose, the family that chooses you back. The flight to Phoenix took 3 hours through clouds that looked like cotton and sky that seemed impossibly blue after years of seeing it through chain link and razor wire. Maggie sat by the window and watched the country pass beneath her. Tennessee's green hills giving way to Texas plains, then New Mexico's rust-red desert, then Arizona's moonscape of rock and sand and cities that bloomed like impossible flowers where water shouldn't allow anything to grow. They landed in Phoenix at 4:15 local time. The heat hit like a wall when they stepped off the plane, dry and relentless, nothing like Tennessee's humid summers. The air smelled different too. Dust and sage and something chemical Maggie couldn't identify. Scottsdale was 20 minutes from the airport, a city of golf courses and spas and neighborhoods where houses cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Desert Crown Estates sat in the foothills north of town, gated and guarded, and designed to keep out anyone who didn't belong. Dan handled the gate guard, spinning a story about being old friends of Dr. Whitfield's visiting from out of town. The guard checked a list, made a call, waved them through. The houses inside looked like they'd been airlifted from a magazine spread. Spanish tile roofs, pristine landscaping, water features that seemed obscene in the middle of the desert. The Whitfield house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, sprawling and single-story with a circular driveway and fountain out front. Dan parked across the street. For a long moment, no one moved. Maggie stared at the house where her sister lived, where Sarah had spent 6 years as someone else, married to a man who probably didn't know her real name or her real history. 6 years while Maggie sat in prison. 6 years of comfort bought with blood money and lies. Are you ready for this? Henry's voice was gentle, understanding. Maggie thought about Emma's question. Would you forgive her? She still didn't have an answer, but she had questions of her own. 20 years worth of questions. And the woman who could answer them was dying in that house across the street. I'm ready. They walked to the door together. The four of them. A strange delegation united by the need for truth. Maggie rang the bell. Footsteps approached from inside, slow and shuffling, the walk of someone whose body had become an obstacle instead of a tool. The door opened. Sarah stood there and Maggie's breath caught in her throat. Her sister had always been beautiful. The pretty one, the charming one, the one who could light up a room just by walking into it. Age and illness had stolen that beauty ruthlessly. Sarah was gaunt, her cheekbones too sharp, her skin sallow. A silk scarf covered her head where chemotherapy had taken her hair. But her eyes, those pale blue eyes Maggie would have recognized anywhere, were as sharp and calculating as ever. For 5 seconds, neither sister spoke. 20 years collapsed into this moment, this doorway, this impossible reunion. Then Sarah smiled, a thin, cold smile that held no warmth, no surprise, no remorse. Maggie, I was wondering when you'd find me. Sarah stepped back from the doorway, one hand pressed against the wall for support. The movement spoke of weakness, of a body that had become unreliable. She wore expensive clothes, silk lounge pants, and a cashmere sweater, but they hung loose on a frame that had lost too much weight too quickly. Please come in. If you've traveled this far, we should at least be comfortable while we have our conversation. The interior matched the exterior's wealth. Everything white or cream or pale gray, furniture that looked designed for magazines rather than living. Art on the walls that probably cost more than Maggie's house had sold for. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the desert. All that brown emptiness stretching toward mountains in the distance. Not a single family photograph anywhere. Nothing personal. Nothing that suggested a real human being occupied this space rather than a carefully constructed character. Sarah led them to a sitting room, lowered herself into a leather chair with movements that suggested pain she was trying to hide. Maggie remained standing, unable to make herself sit, unable to pretend this was a normal visit between sisters who hadn't seen each other in 2 decades. Henry and Rachel took positions near the windows. Dan stayed close to the door, his investigator's instincts putting him between Sarah and any potential exit. All of them silent, letting Maggie take the lead in a confrontation she'd waited 20 years to have. You look terrible. The words came out before Maggie could stop them. Honest and cruel and true. Sarah's laugh was dry, humorless. Pancreatic cancer will do that. 4 months, maybe 6 if I'm unlucky. The doctors use words like palliative care and making comfortable. They stopped pretending chemo would do anything except make me sicker 3 weeks ago. I don't care. Maggie's hands clenched at her sides. I don't care that you're dying. I care that you destroyed my life. I care that you let me rot in prison for 20 years. I care that you stole everything I had and felt nothing. Oh, I felt something. Sarah's eyes were cold, sharp despite the illness eating her from inside. I felt satisfied. I felt vindicated. I felt like for once in my life the universe had balanced the scales. Rachel moved forward slightly, her voice sharp with professional outrage. Mrs. Whitfield, you're aware that we found your confession letter. The one you left in the attic of Margaret's house, the one that admits to framing your sister for murder. Sarah's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked almost bored. Is that what you think brought you here? Some letter I wrote 15 years ago when I was feeling dramatic? Congratulations, detective. You found a piece of paper. It's admissible evidence. Rachel's voice hardened. Combined with the financial records we've uncovered, the insurance fraud, the false identity you used to collect $2 million. We have enough to overturn Margaret's conviction. Prove it. Sarah leaned back in her chair, a gesture that would have been casual if not for the wince that crossed her face. Prove Diana Wilson was me. Prove I collected that insurance money. Prove any of it in a court of law with evidence that will hold up under cross-examination. I'm dying. You have maybe 4 months to build a case, get it to trial, and convict me before I'm dead anyway. Good luck with that. Henry spoke for the first time, his voice carrying decades of courtroom authority. We don't need a conviction, Sarah. We need Margaret's exoneration. Your letter alone, combined with the timeline inconsistencies and evidence gaps in the original investigation, that's enough to overturn her conviction. You've already given us what we need to free her legally. How wonderful for Margaret. Sarah's voice dripped venom, each word precisely chosen to inflict maximum damage. Free at 72. Free to annul all those golden years I stole. Free to live in poverty without her husband, without her home, without anything except the knowledge that her baby sister hated her enough to destroy her. Tell me, Maggie, does freedom taste as sweet as you imagined, or does it taste like ash? Maggie felt something crack inside her chest. Some wall she'd built to protect herself from this exact moment. Why? That's all I want to know. Why did you hate me enough to do this? You really don't know. Sarah leaned forward despite the obvious pain it caused. You genuinely cannot understand what you did to me. Mother's perfect daughter. So blind you never saw what was right in front of you. Our mother loved both of us. Mother tolerated me. She loved you. There's a difference. And if you can't see it, that's because you never had to. You were the good one, the responsible one, the one who did everything right while I was the disappointment, the problem child, the one who required damage control at every family gathering. Maggie shook her head, memories fighting Sarah's version. Their mother had been strict with Sarah, yes, but only because Sarah had needed boundaries. The late nights sneaking out, the failed classes, the boyfriends mother disapproved of. Maggie had been easier because she'd wanted to be good, had found satisfaction in rules and structure. That wasn't favoritism. That was you making choices and mother responding to them. And when mother died, was that me making choices too? Sarah's laugh turned into a cough, harsh and wet. She recovered slowly, wiping her mouth with a tissue that came away spotted with blood. The will. You remember the will, Maggie? How could you forget? The moment our mother made it absolutely clear which daughter she valued. The inheritance. They were finally arriving at the root of everything. The moment Sarah believed justified the next 20 years of destruction. Mother left me the house. You got the life insurance. That's how she wanted it divided. $200,000 in property to you. Sarah's voice shook with rage that hadn't diminished in 30 years. $23,000 in insurance to me. You got the house grandmother Eleanor built. The land our family had owned for 4 generations. The china, the jewelry, the furniture. Everything with history and meaning and value. I got enough money to buy a used car and first month's rent on an apartment. I didn't ask for the house. I didn't write the will. Mother made that choice, not me. And you never questioned it, never thought maybe your sister deserved half, never offered to share or split or make it fair. You just took it all and felt grateful while I got scraps and learned my place in the family hierarchy. The accusation landed like a punch because Sarah was right about one thing. Maggie had never questioned the inheritance. She'd been sad about her mother's death, overwhelmed by grief and funeral arrangements and the weight of loss. When the lawyer read the will, Maggie had simply accepted and grateful for the house, grateful for the stability, never wondering if the division was just. I would have shared if you'd asked. If you'd said you felt hurt or excluded, we could have worked something out. I shouldn't have had to ask. Sarah's words came out like shards of glass. That's the point you'll never understand. You got everything as if it was your natural right, and I got nothing unless I begged for it. That was my entire childhood in one document. Mother's final message, Maggie matters, Sarah doesn't. Dan had been standing by the door, watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone trained to spot patterns in human behavior. Now he stepped forward, pulled out his tablet, and placed it on the coffee table between them. Mrs. Whitfield, I'm an insurance fraud investigator. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I'd like to show you something that suggests your story isn't quite as simple as childhood resentment. He tapped the screen, brought up a document. This is Victor Castellano's life insurance policy. $2 million payout. Established in 2004, 2 years before his murder. Primary beneficiary was Patricia Castellano, his wife. But here's what's interesting. The secondary beneficiary, the person who would collect if Patricia was deceased or convicted of involvement in Victor's death, was someone named Diana Wilson. And Diana Wilson, according to Social Security records, didn't exist before 2005. Sarah's face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. Calculation. The same cold assessment Maggie had seen in the courtroom 20 years ago. You had an affair with Victor Castellano for 8 months before his murder. Dan's voice stayed level, clinical. Witness statements place you at his office multiple times. You helped him establish this insurance policy. You positioned yourself as the secondary beneficiary under a false identity. When Victor wouldn't leave his wife, when he chose his money over you, you killed him. That was the plan, wasn't it? Kill Victor, frame his wife Patricia, collect $2 million when she was convicted. Sarah said nothing, but her silence was its own confirmation. Except Patricia had an alibi. Dan continued. She was at a charity gala the night Victor died. 200 witnesses, ironclad. So you needed a different scapegoat, someone who trusted you, someone who had access to money and resources, someone the police would believe capable of murder. You were perfect, Maggie. Sarah's voice was soft now, almost conversational. You'd do anything for your baby sister. All I had to do was cry and tell you I was in danger. You took that flash drive without question. Hid it exactly where I told you to. Promised to protect me. You made it so easy. The memory rushed back with visceral clarity. That September night in 2006, Sarah pounding on her door past midnight, mascara running, hands shaking, talking about gambling debts and dangerous men who would kill her if she didn't pay. Maggie had believed every word, had taken the flash drive Sarah gave her, hidden it in her bedroom closet like Sarah asked, promised to go to the authorities if anything happened. The flash drive never had financial documents on it, did it? Sarah smiled, and there was something almost proud in it. Detailed plans for Victor's murder, his security schedule that I'd copied from his office files, diagrams of his house, instructions for Curtis Webb, though I never actually contacted him. All written in handwriting I'd been practicing for months. Your handwriting, Maggie. I had years of birthday cards and Christmas letters to copy from. You always did have distinctive script. Rachel was recording now, phone held steady, documenting every word. And the money in Curtis Webb's trailer? $8,000 traced to Margaret's account? Power of attorney. Sarah looked at Maggie. Remember when Bobby had his heart attack in 2004? You were so scared something would happen to both of you. You gave me legal access to your accounts so I could handle things if you were incapacitated. I withdrew the money, drove to Webb's trailer while he was passed out drunk, left it there along with some of Victor's belongings to tie him to the crime. Then I made an anonymous call to the police about a man named Curtis Webb who'd been seen near Victor's house. And Victor? Henry's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of judgment. How did you kill him? I did it myself. Sarah's tone suggested she was discussing something mundane, a home repair or a grocery list. 2 shots. His home office. Made it look like a professional hit. Then I called the police with my anonymous tip and waited. 3 days later, they arrested Maggie. The flash drive in her closet. The money trailed to Webb. The motive I'd carefully constructed about her resenting Victor for foreclosing on a property. Everything lined up perfectly. But you had to testify. Maggie's voice came out strangled. You had to stand in court and lie. You had to cry and tell them I threatened you. That was the hardest part. Sarah's expression suggested it hadn't been hard at all. I practiced for weeks, the right amount of tears, the voice breaking at precise moments. The way to look at you with just enough love and regret to seem believable. And you know what, Maggie? It felt good. For once in my life, I was the one with power. I was the one everyone believed. I was the center of attention while you, perfect Maggie, sat there helpless. Rachel's hands were shaking, her face flushed with barely contained rage. You sent an innocent woman to prison for 20 years because you were jealous, because your mother's will hurt your feelings. That's what this comes down to. You reduce it to that because you never lived it. Sarah's voice rose, stronger than it should have been given her condition, fueled by decades of resentment. You never spent your childhood being compared and found wanting. Never watched your sister get praised for the same things you got punished for. Never realized your mother's love had conditions and you didn't meet them. Dan pulled up more documents on his tablet. Let's talk about what you got from destroying your sister. The house sale, $215,000. The cash from her safe, $180,000. Bobby's workshop equipment and heirlooms, another $30,000. That's $425,000 from Margaret alone. Add the $2 million from Victor's insurance that you collected under your Diana Wilson identity, and you walked away with over $2.4 million. Sarah's face remained impassive. I earned every dollar. You murdered a man and framed your sister. Dan's voice stayed level, but his eyes were hard. Then you disappeared. Built a new identity, married Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a wealthy retired surgeon who had no idea who you really were. You've been living here in luxury for 6 years while Margaret sat in a cell. Marcus knows now. Sarah's smile was thin. He called you, didn't he? This morning, after I told him everything. After he found the accounts I've been hiding. He found more than accounts. Dan tapped his screen again. $3 million in offshore accounts. Cayman Islands, Switzerland, Singapore. The $2 million from Victor's insurance, laundered through shell companies. The $430,000 from Margaret's estate. Investment gains over 20 years. You've been living off blood money and lies. And I'd do it again. Sarah leaned back in her chair, exhaustion finally showing through the bravado. Every single choice I made, I'd make again. Because for 20 years, I've lived the life I deserved. The life that should have been mine from the beginning if Mother hadn't decided you were worth more than me. Maggie moved closer, standing over Sarah's chair, forcing her sister to look up at her. It matters because I need to understand if any part of the sister I loved still exists. If somewhere underneath the calculation and the cruelty, there's a piece of Sarah who regrets this, who wishes she'd made different choices, who can admit that destroying me didn't actually fix anything broken inside her. For a long moment, Sarah didn't respond. She looked tired suddenly, the burst of energy that had fueled her confession draining away. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, lacking the venom that had sharpened every word before. You want me to say I'm sorry. You want deathbed repentance. The sister you loved returning for one final scene of reconciliation. I can't give you that. I'm not sorry I did it. I'm only sorry I didn't get more time to enjoy what I took from you. The words should have hurt. They were designed to hurt, crafted to leave scars. But instead, Maggie felt something close to relief, because this was clear. This was honest. This was Sarah stripping away any remaining illusion that the girl who'd shared Maggie's bedroom, who'd held Maggie's hand at their mother's funeral, who'd called Maggie her hero, had ever been more than an elaborate performance. Did you ever love me? Even once? Sarah considered the question with disturbing thoughtfulness. I love the idea of having a sister. I love what you could do for me. But love you as a person, as someone separate from my needs? I don't think I know how to love that way. Mother never taught me. She showed me love was conditional, transactional. You meet standards, you receive affection. You fail, you get nothing. I failed from the beginning, so I learned to take what I needed however I could get it. Rachel had stopped recording. Even she seemed stunned by Sarah's cold dissection of her own capacity for human connection. Dan stood frozen by the door, his investigator's detachment cracked, by witnessing something fundamentally broken in another person. I would have given you half the house if you'd asked. Maggie felt tears on her face but didn't wipe them away. I would have shared everything. You never had to destroy me. You chose to. And you chose to accept everything Mother gave you without question. Sarah's voice carried no heat now, just a flat finality. We both made choices, Maggie. Mine were just more honest about their selfishness. Before anyone could respond, footsteps sounded in the hallway. A man appeared in the doorway, tall and distinguished, late 60s with silver hair, in the bearing of someone accustomed to respect. His eyes were red, face drawn with a particular exhaustion that comes from having your world collapse. Margaret Brennan? The man's voice was cultured but strained. I'm Dr. Marcus Whitfield. I believe we spoke on the phone this morning. Dan moved slightly, positioning himself between Marcus and Sarah, unsure of the dynamic. Marcus noticed and raised a hand. I'm not here to interfere. I just wanted to meet the woman my wife destroyed. The woman I've been married to Sarah for 7 years, or thought I was married to someone named Diana. This morning she told me the truth, about Victor Castellano, about you, about everything. Marcus stepped into the room, careful to keep distance from Sarah. When I met Diana, she told me she was orphaned young, that she'd built herself up from nothing through hard work and determination. I admired her resilience, her strength. I never questioned her past because, why would I? You don't assume the person you share your bed with is a murderer living under a false name. He pulled a folder from his jacket, handed it to Dan. These are copies of every financial document I could access. Offshore accounts, shell companies. money transfers. Everything I found after she tried to move $500,000 this morning to an account in Switzerland that I didn't know existed. I've given the originals to my attorney. I've filed for divorce, emergency dissolution based on fraud and misrepresentation. Tennessee law allows it when one spouse has concealed fundamental facts about their identity. Why are you helping us? Maggie's voice was soft. You don't know me. Marcus looked at Sarah, and something like grief crossed his face. Because I held her hand through chemotherapy. I sat with her through every treatment. I told her I loved her every single day. And this entire time she was living a lie. She let me love someone who didn't exist. That's its own kind of cruelty. Sarah said nothing, just watched her husband with those calculating eyes. Even now, dying and exposed, she seemed to be assessing angles, looking for advantage. The accounts you found, Dan was already scanning through the documents Marcus had provided. How much total? 3 million, give or take. Marcus's voice was hollow. The 2 million from Victor Castellano's life insurance, laundered through various channels over the years. The money from Margaret's estate, investment gains, all of it hidden in accounts I never knew existed. This morning when I blocked her transfer, she laughed, actually laughed. She said I was finally seeing the real her. He turned to Maggie, and his expression held genuine remorse. Mrs. Brennan, I'm so sorry for what she did to you, for not seeing who she really was. For the 7 years she spent my money, slept in my house, let me believe we had a real marriage when she was just using me like she used everyone else. You're a victim too. Maggie's grace in this moment was instinctive. You couldn't have known. I should have questioned more. Marcus shook his head. There were signs, small things, the way she never wanted to talk about her past, how she avoided photographs, the times I'd catch her staring at nothing with this look of satisfaction, like she was enjoying some private joke. I told myself she was just private, that everyone has secrets. I never imagined. The room fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of a landscaping crew working somewhere in the neighborhood. Sarah sat in her chair, diminished by illness but still defiant. The 3 people she'd hurt most standing around her. Marcus, who'd loved a lie. Maggie, who'd lost 20 years. Dan and Rachel and Henry, who'd devoted themselves to undoing her crime. Margaret, Sarah's voice cut through the quiet. I want you to know something. One true thing before you go. Maggie waited but didn't move closer. Her sister struggled to stand, managed it with visible effort, one hand on the chair arm for support. The chemotherapy had stolen her hair. The cancer had stolen her body. But those eyes remained sharp as ever. I did love you once. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. When we were children. Before I understood what it meant that mother loved you more. Before I learned that love was something you earned through comparison. There were years when you were my hero, my protector, the person I wanted to be when I grew up. She paused, breathing labored. But that little girl died the day mother's will was read. And what grew in her place couldn't afford love. It would have destroyed what little of me survived. Maggie stood frozen, processing this admission. Part confession, part justification, all of it 20 years too late. She could see both versions of her sister overlaid like a double exposure. The child who'd climbed into her bed during thunderstorms. The woman who'd destroyed her without remorse. Both real, both true, both impossible to reconcile. Goodbye, Sarah. Goodbye, Maggie. Sarah's smile was sad in a way that seemed almost genuine. I hope freedom is worth what it cost. They left the house together, walking out into the Arizona heat that felt oppressive after the air-conditioned interior. Dan helped Maggie into the rental car. Marcus stood on the driveway watching them go, his face a mask of grief for a marriage that had never been real. 20 minutes of silence filled the car as they drove away from Desert Crown Estates. The desert landscape rolled past, brown earth and saguaro cacti standing like sentinels, mountains purple in the distance. Maggie sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her mind trying to process everything she'd heard. Are you okay? Dan's question was gentle. Maggie considered it. Was she okay? She just heard her sister confess to murder with pride. Watch Sarah justified 20 years of Maggie's life stolen because of a perceived slight 30 years ago. Listen to her explain the frame-up with clinical precision, detailing every manipulation, every lie, every calculated move to destroy someone who'd done nothing but love her. No, but I will be. Dan nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. What she said about the will, about your mother favoring you. Do you think she was right? I don't know. Maggie's voice was honest. I never felt favored. I just tried to be good, to do what was expected. Sarah was wilder, harder to control. Mother was stricter with her because of it. But was that favoritism or just parenting two different children differently? I've asked myself that question for 20 years, and I still don't have an answer. Henry spoke it from the back seat, his voice carrying the weight of decades of presiding over family tragedies. Sometimes the person who benefits from a system doesn't see it working for them, and sometimes privilege is invisible to the privileged. That doesn't excuse what Sarah did. Nothing excuses it, but it might explain how she justified it to herself. She had a choice. Rachel's anger was still fresh, still burning. Everyone faces unfairness. Everyone deals with parents who make mistakes. Most people don't commit murder and frame their siblings. Sarah made a choice to become a monster. That's on her, not on your mother's will. They drove to the Phoenix airport in the last light of evening, the sky painting itself in the shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the ugliness of the day. Dan returned the rental car. They moved through the terminal like ghosts, exhausted by confrontation and truth. On the flight back to Nashville, Maggie sat by the window and watched Arizona disappear beneath them. Somewhere down there, Sarah was dying in that sterile white house alone with her choices and her stolen wealth. Marcus was probably signing divorce papers, trying to understand how he'd been fooled for 7 years. And Maggie was flying back to Tennessee with evidence that would free her legally, but could never give her back what she'd lost. Rachel worked on her laptop the entire flight, drafting the exoneration petition, building the legal framework that would overturn Maggie's conviction. Henry dozed fitfully, looking every one of his 78 years, the weight of delayed justice heavy on his shoulders. Dan sat beside Maggie, not speaking, just present, offering the quiet support of someone who understood that sometimes there were no words that helped. They landed in Nashville past midnight. Kate was waiting at arrivals, her pregnant belly prominent, her face creased with concern. Dan hugged his wife, whispered something in her ear that made her look at Maggie with tears in her eyes. The drive back to Grover's Mill took an hour through darkness, punctuated by highway lights and the occasional truck passing in the opposite direction. Emma was asleep when they got home, but she'd left a note on the refrigerator in careful 9-year-old handwriting. Welcome home, Grandma Maggie. Did you get your answers? Love, Emma. Grandma Maggie. The name wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. This child had decided she mattered, had given her a title that meant family without requiring blood. Maggie folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket next to the wooden cross she'd carried for 20 years. Kate made tea despite the late hour. They sat around the kitchen table. This table in this kitchen that used to be Maggie's and now belonged to people who'd shown her more kindness in 3 days than her own sister had in a lifetime. She's dying. Maggie said it out loud for the first time, making it real. 4 to 6 months, the cancer is everywhere. Even if we wanted to prosecute, she'll be dead before trial. We don't need a trial, Rachel's voice was firm. We have her confession on recording. We have the letter she wrote. We have financial records proving she collected $2 million under a false identity. We have Marcus Whitfield's testimony about her real identity. Judge Caldwell's statement about irregularities in your trial. It's enough for exoneration. I'll file the petition Monday morning. And then what? Maggie's question hung in the air. I'll be declared innocent. My name will be cleared. But Sarah will die unpunished. She'll never face a courtroom, never sit in a cell like I did, never lose 20 years like I lost. Henry leaned forward, his hands wrapped around his mug. Justice isn't always punishment. Sometimes justice is truth. Sometimes it's the record being corrected. Sometimes it's knowing that everyone now understands what really happened, even if the person responsible never faces consequences. That doesn't feel like enough. I know. Henry's voice was gentle, but it's what we have. Kate reached across the table, took Maggie's hand. You survived. That's what matters. Sarah tried to erase you and she failed. You're here. You're free. You're building a new life with people who care about you. That's the real victory. Maggie thought about that as she lay in bed an hour later, staring at the ceiling of the guest room that used to be her sewing room. Victory. Was it victory to be free at 72, with nothing but borrowed clothes and the kindness of strangers? Was it victory to know the truth but never see justice served? Was it victory to understand why her sister hated her enough to destroy her? only to realize that understanding changed nothing. She thought about Sarah dying in that White House in Arizona, thought about Marcus Whitfield discovering the woman he loved had never existed, thought about Victor Castellano, killed because he chose his money over his mistress, thought about all the lives Sarah had damaged in pursuit of what she believed she deserved. And she thought about Emma, sleeping upstairs in her own room in this house that should have been Maggie's. Who'd decided that Maggie was worth calling Grandma despite knowing nothing about her except that she was sad? Maybe that was victory. Maybe the victory wasn't in seeing Sarah punished. Maybe it was in refusing to become what Sarah had become. Refusing to let bitterness and rage consume everything good that remained. Refusing to measure her worth by what had been stolen instead of what could still be built. Sarah had taken 20 years. But she couldn't take the next 20 unless Maggie let her. And Maggie was done letting Sarah take anything. Morning came too soon. Pale light filtering through curtains that weren't hers in a room that wasn't hers in a house that used to be hers. But the smell of coffee drifted up the stairs, and she could hear Emma singing off-key in the kitchen, and Kate's laugh and Dan's low voice responding to his daughter's chatter. This was what Sarah had tried to destroy. Not just Maggie's freedom, or her home, or her savings. Sarah had tried to destroy Maggie's capacity for this, for connection, for trust, for believing that people could be good without ulterior motive, for accepting kindness without suspicion. She'd failed. Maggie got up, dressed in borrowed clothes, went downstairs to join a family that wasn't hers but had chosen her anyway. Emma bounced up when she saw Maggie, threw her arms around her waist. "Did you get your answers?" "I did, sweetheart." "Were they good answers or sad answers?" "Both." Maggie smoothed Emma's hair. Sometimes answers are both at the same time. Emma considered this with the seriousness of someone twice her age. "That's okay. Mom says knowing the truth is better than wondering, even when the truth is sad." "Your mom is very wise." Breakfast was simple. Scrambled eggs and toast and coffee that tasted like hope. Dan outlined the next steps. Rachel would file the exoneration petition Monday. They'd need statements from everyone. Maggie would have to write down everything she remembered about the night Sarah came to her with the flash drive, about Sarah's testimony, about every detail that contradicted what Maggie knew to be true. "How long until a hearing?" Rachel says 6 to 8 weeks, if we're lucky. Dan took a sip of coffee. With the confession recording and all the other evidence, the AG's office has already indicated they'll support the motion. They don't want to defend a conviction this compromised. 6 to 8 weeks. After 20 years, that felt like no time at all. Maggie thought about Sarah in Arizona, probably lying in that sterile bedroom, cancer eating through her like punishment delivered by biology instead of law. Would she live to see Maggie exonerated? Would she know that her carefully constructed frame had collapsed? Did it matter if she knew? Maggie spent the day writing. Hours of sitting at the Morrisons' dining room table with a legal pad and pen, reconstructing the worst moments of her life. The night Sarah appeared at her door with tears and terror, the flash drive pressed into her hand, Sarah's whispered instructions about hiding it, about going to the police if anything happened, the fear in Sarah's voice that had seemed so real. Then Victor's murder. The police at her door 3 days later. The search warrant, their faces when they found the flash drive exactly where Sarah said it would be. The questions about Curtis Webb, about money transfers, about Victor Castellano, and a foreclosure from 9 years ago that Maggie barely remembered. The arrest, the trial, Sarah on the witness stand, crying, apologizing, destroying Maggie with every word. The jury's faces as they listened, believing, convicting. The judge's expression as he sentenced her to 30 years. Bobby in the gallery, his face gray, his hand pressed over his heart like he could physically hold it together. 2 years later, he'd be dead, and Maggie would get the news in a visiting room from a prison chaplain instead of being beside him like she should have been. She wrote it all down, every detail Rachel needed, every contradiction between what Sarah testified and what Maggie knew to be true. Every piece of evidence that now made sense in light of Sarah's confession. The truth finally, completely, in her own words. When she finished, the sun was setting, her hand cramped from hours of writing. The legal pad was full, pages and pages of testimony that would help free her. But writing it hadn't felt cathartic. It had felt like reopening wounds that had scarred over badly, exposing tissue that hadn't properly healed. Rachel came by that evening to collect the statement. She read through it carefully, nodding, making notes. "This is good. This is exactly what we need. Combined with everything else, the judge won't have any choice but to grant exoneration. And then your name is cleared. The conviction is erased. You're officially innocent. Rachel's smile was fierce, and you can start putting your life back together. What life? Maggie's question came out harsher than she intended. I'm 72 years old. I have no home, no savings, no job. Bobby's dead. My sister is dying, but I can't even feel good about that because it means she'll never face real consequences. What exactly am I putting back together? Rachel's expression softened. I don't know, but I know you have people who care about you. I know you survived something that destroys most people. I know you're sitting here fighting instead of giving up. That's not nothing. After Rachel left, Maggie sat on the Morrisons' back porch and watched night settle over Tennessee. Crickets sang in the grass. Fireflies blinked in the darkness like tiny stars. Somewhere in the house behind her, Emma was getting ready for bed. Dan was reading her a story. Kate was folding laundry with her hand on her swollen belly. Normal life. Simple life. The kind of life Sarah's jealousy couldn't touch because it wasn't built on money or property or inheritance. It was built on choosing to be kind, choosing to help someone who needed it, choosing to believe that doing the right thing mattered more than protecting what was yours. Maggie understood now what Sarah had never been able to see. Mother's will hadn't made Maggie rich. The house and the heirlooms and the $200,000 in property, all of it was just stuff. It could be sold, stolen, lost. What mattered was what you built with other people, the family you chose, the love you gave, the kindness you showed even when the world gave you every reason to be bitter. Sarah had stolen Maggie's things, but not her capacity for this. For sitting on a porch that wasn't hers, in a house full of people who had taken her in, feeling grateful instead of robbed. That was the real inheritance. The one that couldn't be written into a will or stolen by a sister who'd learned all the wrong lessons from their mother's favoritism. Monday came. Rachel filed the petition for exoneration. Word spread quickly through Grover's Mill. Former students reached out through social media. Old colleagues called the Morrison house. People who'd believed in her conviction and people who'd always doubted it, all of them suddenly wanting to be part of the story now that Maggie was going to be proven innocent. The news media picked it up by Tuesday. Local coverage first, then regional, then national. Woman freed after 20 years, sister's deathbed confession reveals frame up. Camera crews appeared outside the Morrison house. Reporters called, asking for interviews. The story had everything: wrongful conviction, sister's betrayal, murder for insurance money, dying confession. It spread across news sites and social media like wildfire. Dan handled most of the press, his investigators' training making him comfortable with questions and cameras. But eventually a reporter from the New York Times got through, a woman who approached the story with sensitivity instead of sensation. Maggie agreed to one interview. They talked for 3 hours in the Morrison living room while Emma colored in the corner, occasionally interjecting corrections when Maggie got dates wrong. The journalist asked the question everyone wanted answered. How do you feel about your sister now? Maggie had thought about this, practiced her answer, tried to find words that were honest without being cruel, that acknowledged complexity without excusing evil. I understand her better than I did. The resentment she felt about our mother's will, the years of comparing herself to me and feeling less than. I see how that wounded her, but understanding doesn't mean forgiving. Sarah made choices. She chose to kill Victor Castellano. She chose to frame me instead of talking to me. She chose cruelty when she could have chosen communication. I lost my husband, my home, 20 years of freedom because she couldn't let go of being hurt. So no, I don't forgive her. But I do release her. She can't hurt me anymore because I understand exactly who she was. And that understanding is enough. The article ran the following Sunday with the headline, "Bitterness and Gratitude Can Exist Together. Margaret Brennan on Life After Exoneration." By Monday morning, the story had been shared 500,000 times. Rachel's office was flooded with messages from people offering support, sending donations, sharing their own stories of wrongful conviction. The public pressure added weight to Maggie's petition, made her case impossible to ignore or delay. The hearing was scheduled for late July, 4 months and 8 days after Maggie walked out of prison carrying everything she owned in a plastic bag. She had her answers now. She understood why Sarah had done it. She knew every detail of the frame-up, every lie, Every manipulation. She'd looked into her sister's dying eyes and heard the truth without apology or remorse. And somehow, knowing made it both better and worse. Better because there was no more mystery, no more wondering. Worse because understanding Sarah's pain didn't excuse what she'd done. It just added another layer of tragedy to a story that already had too many victims. But Maggie was done being a victim. Sarah had tried to make her one. The justice system had made her one. 20 years in prison had made her one. But sitting on the Morrisons' porch, watching Emma play in the yard, feeling Kate's hand on her shoulder in passing, seeing Dan treat her with respect and kindness he didn't owe her, Maggie understood something fundamental. You're only a victim if you let that define you. She was also a survivor, a fighter, a woman who'd held on to her innocence for 20 years when everyone said she was guilty, a woman who'd walked out of prison and refused to give up even when she discovered everything had been stolen. A woman who'd flown to Arizona and faced her dying sister and demanded truth instead of hiding from it. That was who she was now, not the victim of Sarah's betrayal, the survivor of it. And there was a difference that mattered. The weeks between filing the exoneration petition and the hearing stretched long and strange, filled with the peculiar rhythm of waiting for justice that had already been delayed 20 years. Maggie fell into a routine with the Morrison family that felt both temporary and permanent, like she was living in borrowed time that might evaporate at any moment. She helped Kate with household tasks, her hands remembering the muscle memory of cooking and cleaning and caring for a home even after 2 decades away. She read stories to Emma before bed, the girl curling against her side with absolute trust that Maggie hadn't earned but was given anyway. She sat on the porch in the evenings with Dan, both of them quiet, watching fireflies blink in the darkness, while somewhere in Arizona her sister grew sicker with each passing day. 3 weeks after their return from Scottsdale, Henry called with news that shifted something in Maggie's chest. The Tennessee Attorney General's office had reviewed Rachel's petition. They weren't going to fight it. Given the overwhelming evidence, the recorded confession, the financial records proving fraud, they were recommending immediate exoneration. The hearing, originally scheduled for late July, was being moved up. June 15th, 3 weeks away. Rachel drove out from Nashville that evening, her small car rattling up the Morrisons' driveway just as the sun touched the horizon. She carried a thick folder and the kind of energy that comes from winning before the fight even starts. They're not contesting it. She spread papers across the kitchen table. The AG's office submitted their recommendation this afternoon. They're supporting your exoneration based on newly discovered evidence. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to your hosts, will preside. She's got a reputation for fairness, and she's reviewed all our materials. Barring something completely unexpected, you're going to walk out of that courthouse a free woman. Legally free. Officially innocent. Maggie's hands trembled as she looked at the documents. Words like vacated and exonerated and innocent jumped out at her. Technical language that meant the nightmare was ending. But instead of joy, she felt something closer to vertigo, like standing at the edge of a cliff and being told to jump with the promise that flight was possible if she just trusted enough. What happens after? The question came out small. After I'm declared innocent, what happens then? Rachel's smile was gentle. Then you start over. You can apply for compensation from the state. Tennessee law allows $20,000 for every year of wrongful imprisonment. That would be $400,000. Plus, we're working with Marcus Whitfield's attorneys to recover funds from Sarah's estate. She stole from you. Those assets should be returned. $400,000. It sounded like a fortune until Maggie did the math. $20,000 per year divided by 365 days came out to about $55 per day. $55 for each day she'd spent in a cell, for missing Bobby's funeral, for not being able to hold his hand when his heart gave out, for losing her home and her savings and 20 years of life she could never get back. The number felt both enormous and completely inadequate. That night, sleep came in fragments. Maggie dozed and woke and dozed again, her mind cycling through memories she'd tried to bury. Not memories of prison, though those were bad enough. Memories of before, of Sarah as a child, small and fierce, defending Maggie from bullies on the playground with a fury that seemed disproportionate even then. Sarah at 15, crying in Maggie's room after their mother criticized her college application essay, asking why nothing she did was ever good enough. Sarah at 23, showing up drunk at Maggie and Bobby's door after her first divorce. saying she'd ruined everything good in her life, and Maggie was the only person who had ever believed in her. Those memories felt like artifacts from another universe, evidence of a person who'd either never existed or had died so completely that what remained wore her face like a mask. The girl who'd needed protection had become the threat. The sister who'd asked why nothing was good enough had decided to take what she felt she deserved no matter the cost. And Maggie, who tried to love her through it all, had been the easiest target because trust made you vulnerable in ways strangers never were. Morning brought Emma to her door, already dressed for school, her backpack decorated with patches and pins. "Grandma Maggie, can you make my lunch today?" Mom's feeling sick again. Kate's pregnancy had reached the uncomfortable stage where mornings were difficult and her back hurt constantly. Maggie found her in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with one hand pressed to her spine and the other cradling her belly. The baby was due in 8 weeks, right around the time Maggie's hearing would be over, right around the time she'd have to figure out where she was going to live and what she was going to do with a life she was still learning how to inhabit. "Go rest." Maggie took over the lunch making, her hands moving through the familiar motions. Sandwich, apple slices, carrots, a cookie from the nursery Kate kept filled despite Emma's protest that nobody ate homemade cookies anymore. The routine felt good, simple, the kind of task that had a clear beginning and end, unlike the complicated emotional work of processing betrayal and preparing for exoneration. Dan came downstairs in his work clothes, tie loose around his neck, briefcase in hand. He'd been putting in long hours at the insurance firm, building cases against fraudsters who thought they were clever enough to beat the system. The irony wasn't lost on Maggie. Her sister had been exactly that kind of person, convinced her intelligence and charm made her untouchable. And she'd been right for 20 years. Only her own dying body had finally caught up with her. "I've been thinking about your case." Dan poured coffee, leaned against the counter. "About Sarah's financial trail, the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the way she moved money to avoid detection. That level of sophistication doesn't happen by accident. She had help, professional help, someone who knew how to launder money and create fake identities and make paper trails disappear. Does it matter?" Maggie handed him the lunch she'd packed for Emma. "She's dying. Even if we found who helped her, what would it change?" It might explain how she collected Victor Castellano's life insurance without raising red flags. Dan's investigator brain was always working, always looking for patterns. Insurance companies are supposed to verify beneficiary identities. Diana Wilson should have triggered alerts. Someone on the inside might have smoothed things over. Someone she paid or charmed or both. You think she had an accomplice? I think she was too smart to do this alone. But unless Marcus finds more records, we'll probably never know. Dan checked his watch. "I need to get to work. Rachel's coming by this afternoon to prep you for the hearing. Judge Morrison will want to hear from you directly. You'll need to be ready." After he left, the house felt quiet except for the tick of the kitchen clock and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Maggie sat at the table with her own coffee and thought about accomplices. Who had helped Sarah? Who knew what she'd done and said nothing? The lawyer who'd handled the house sale must have seen the death certificate, the probate documents, all the paperwork declaring Maggie dead. Had they questioned it or just processed the transaction and collected their fee? The insurance company that paid out $2 million to Diana Wilson, had anyone there wondered why a secondary beneficiary they'd never heard of was suddenly claiming a fortune? Or had Sarah's charm and forged documents been enough to satisfy their due diligence? The truth was that Sarah had succeeded because people wanted to believe her. She'd been beautiful and sane and convincing. She cried at the right moments and told stories that made sense and presented paperwork that looked legitimate. And most people, when confronted with someone who seems genuine, don't dig deeper. They take the easy path of acceptance because suspicion is exhausting and cynicism feels uncharitable. That was the real crime, Maggie thought. Not just what Sarah had done to her, but what Sarah had revealed about how easy it was to destroy someone if you were willing to lie with enough conviction. The system's meant to protect people, courts and lawyers, and insurance companies and witnesses under oath. All of them could be manipulated by someone who understood that people wanted to believe the performance more than they wanted to uncover the truth. Rachel arrived in the afternoon with her briefcase and her fierce determination. She'd printed out questions the judge might ask, scenarios to prepare for, talking points about what Maggie had endured and how the original investigation had failed her. They worked at the dining room table for hours, Maggie's voice growing hoarse from repeating her story over and over. Tell me about the night Sarah came to you with the flash drive. She was crying. She said men were threatening her over gambling debts. She gave me a flash drive and told me it had financial documents, evidence she might need if something happened to her. She asked me to hide it and go to the police if she disappeared. I believed her because she was my sister, and she seemed terrified. Why didn't you look at what was on the flash drive? Because she asked me not to. She said the less I knew, the safer I'd be, and I trusted her. Even after years of her causing problems, even after the divorces and the money troubles and the drama, especially then, I thought she was finally ready to face her mistakes. I thought she was coming to me because I was the one person who wouldn't judge her. Rachel nodded, made notes. Good, that's good. The judge needs to understand that Sarah manipulated your love for her, that your trust wasn't naive, it was what sisters are supposed to have. She weaponized your relationship. They went through it all. The testimony Sarah had given, each lie cataloged and countered. The evidence that had been planted, explained now in light of Sarah's confession. The motive the prosecution had claimed, Maggie's supposed resentment of Victor Castellano, revealed as complete fiction. Every piece of the frame dissected until Maggie could recite it in her sleep. When Rachel finally packed up her briefcase, the sun was setting, and Maggie felt wrung out like a rag. Emma burst through the door from playing outside, grass-stained and sweaty and full of questions about dinner. Kate was resting upstairs, her swollen feet propped on pillows. Dan would be home soon. This family that had taken Maggie in would sit down together for a meal, and she would be part of it, at least for now, at least until the hearing was over and she had to figure out what came next. The days compressed toward June 15th with increasing pressure. Maggie woke each morning with the date counting down in her head. 14 days, 10 days, 1 week. She kept waiting for nerves to hit, for panic about standing in a courtroom again after the last time had ended with her being sentenced to 30 years. But instead of fear, she felt something closer to numbness, like her emotional capacity had been exceeded and what remained was just going through the motions of living until the next thing happened. 5 days before the hearing, the phone rang in the middle of the night. Dan answered it downstairs, his voice low and serious. Maggie heard his footsteps on the stairs, the soft knock on her door. Margaret. He used her full name, which meant bad news. That was Dr. Whitfield. Sarah died 2 hours ago. Hospice called him even though they're divorced. He thought you should know. Maggie sat up in bed, pulling the borrowed robe around her shoulders. The room was dark except for the streetlight filtering through the curtains. Dead. Sarah was dead. The sister who'd destroyed her life, who'd shown no remorse, who'd justified 20 years of Maggie's imprisonment with childhood jealousy and a will that divided things unequally, was gone. And Maggie felt nothing, no relief, no grief, just a hollow space where emotion should have been. Did he say anything else? She left a letter. Marcus has it. He's overnighting it to you. It should arrive tomorrow. Maggie thanked Dan, waited until he went back downstairs, then sat in the darkness of a room that used to be hers, thinking about death and letters and final words from people who'd had years to say them, but waited until they were beyond consequences. Sarah's first confession letter had been written 15 years ago, hidden in a box in the attic, meant to be found only when it was too late to matter. This new letter, written days before death, would be the same. Words chosen carefully to justify and explain and shift blame, even from beyond the grave. She didn't sleep the rest of that night, just lay in bed watching shadows move across the ceiling as cars passed on the street outside, their headlights painting brief patterns that dissolved into darkness. When morning came, she felt like she'd been awake for years. The letter arrived via overnight delivery at 2 in the afternoon, a thick envelope with Marcus Whitfield's return address, Maggie's name written in his careful doctor's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Sarah's flowing script, still beautiful even when her body had been failing, still more aesthetically pleasing than Maggie's own handwriting had ever been. Maggie carried it to the back porch, sat in the chair that had become hers over these weeks of waiting, and read her sister's final message. Maggie, you won. You're free, exonerated, vindicated. Everything I took from you has a name now. And you can tell yourself justice prevailed. Good for you. I'm not sorry. I know that's what you wanted. Deathbed repentance. The sister you loved returning for one final scene where I beg forgiveness and we reconcile before I die. I can't give you that. I'm not sorry I framed you. I'm not sorry I took your money, your house, 20 years of your life. I'm only sorry I didn't enjoy it more. Sorry I spent so much time looking over my shoulder, waiting to be caught, that I never fully savored what I'd won. But here's one truth. I did love you once. When we were small, before I understood mother's love was conditional and I didn't meet the conditions. Before I learned to hate you for being everything I couldn't be. There were years when you were my hero, my protector, the person I most wanted to become. But that girl died the day mother's will was read. And what grew in her place couldn't afford love. It would have destroyed what little of me survived. You'll live another decade, maybe two. You'll tell yourself you've forgiven me, or you haven't, that you understand me, or you don't. None of it matters. I'm dead and you're alive, and that's the only accounting that counts. I hope the years you have left are worth the 20 I took. I hope freedom tastes sweeter than I imagine. Your sister Sarah. Maggie folded the letter carefully, slipped it back in the envelope. Sarah's final words were exactly what she should have expected. Pride, resentment, the barest admission of having once been capable of love before bitterness consumed her completely. No apology, no regret, just Sarah to the end, unable or unwilling to access whatever makes humans capable of genuine remorse. She sat with it for a long time, the envelope in her lap, the afternoon sun warm on her face. Somewhere in Arizona, Sarah's body was being prepared for cremation. Her ashes would be scattered in the desert she'd chosen for her exile, that empty landscape that matched the emptiness inside her. Marcus would handle it alone, this man who'd loved a woman who never existed. And Maggie would go to her hearing in 4 days and be declared innocent of a crime her dead sister had committed. The shape of justice felt wrong somehow, incomplete. Sarah had escaped prison, escaped trial, escaped any real consequence beyond her own body's betrayal. But she'd also escaped peace. She'd died knowing Maggie had found her, that the perfect frame had collapsed, that the sister she tried to erase had refused to stay erased. Maybe that was consequence enough. Maybe knowing she'd failed was the only punishment Sarah could have understood. Emma found her on the porch an hour later, crawled into her lap despite being too big for it. You're sad again. I am. Maggie smoothed the girl's hair. My sister died today. The bad sister who hurt you? Yes. Are you sad she's dead, or sad she was bad? The question was so perfectly Emma, so clear and direct in a way adults forgot how to be. Maggie thought about it, gave her the honest answer. Sad she was bad, sad we couldn't fix it, not sad she's dead. That makes sense. Emma settled more comfortably against Maggie's chest. Mom says sometimes people are too broken to fix, and that's sad, but it's not your fault they broke. Your mom is right about a lot of things. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning, the kind of perfect June day that felt like a gift. Clear skies, comfortable temperature, flowers blooming in gardens along the streets. Maggie woke early, dressed in the outfit Kate had helped her pick out, a simple navy dress that made her look dignified without trying too hard. She stared at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. Not the young teacher who'd been arrested at 52, not the prison inmate who'd survived 20 years. Someone new, still forming, still figuring out what shape she'd take. Dan drove them to the courthouse in downtown Nashville. Henry met them on the steps, Rachel beside him with her briefcase and her fierce determination. Inside, the building hummed with the ordinary business of justice. People in suits hurrying between courtrooms. Lawyers conferring with clients in hushed voices. The accused and the accusers, the guilty and the innocent, all moving through the same halls, all waiting for someone in a robe to determine the truth of their situations. The courtroom was smaller than Maggie remembered. She'd been tried in a different room, a bigger space that had felt cavernous when she stood at the defense table listening to Sarah destroy her. This room was more intimate, fewer seats in the gallery, less distance between the judge's bench and where she would stand. The gallery filled quickly. Former colleagues from her teaching days, neighbors who'd known her before the arrest, journalists with notepads and cameras. And in the front row, Kate and Emma, Dan having sacrificed his seat to stay with his family. Emma held a sign she'd made, the letters carefully colored in rainbow markers. Welcome home, Grandma Maggie. Something in Maggie's chest cracked open at the sight of that sign. Home. This child who'd known her for only a few weeks had decided Maggie belonged somewhere, that she had a place to return to, that she mattered enough to welcome back. All rise. Judge Patricia Morrison entered, and the room stood as one. She was younger than Henry, maybe mid-50s, with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who took her responsibility seriously. She settled into her seat, looked over the paperwork before her, then looked up at Maggie with an expression that seemed to see past the surface into the 20 years of injustice beneath. Mrs. Brennan, I've spent the last several weeks reviewing your case with exhaustive care. I've listened to your sister's recorded confession. I've examined the financial records proving she collected $2 million in life insurance under a false identity. I've read Judge Caldwell's testimony about irregularities he observed during your original trial. I've considered the confession letter she left and the power of attorney documents she used to access your bank accounts. Judge Morrison paused. Let the weight of that review settle. The evidence is overwhelming and troubling. Your sister orchestrated an elaborate frame-up, murdered a man, and allowed you to spend 20 years in prison for crimes you didn't commit. On behalf of the state of Tennessee, I apologize. Our justice system failed you catastrophically. The apology hung in the air, formal and inadequate, but also necessary. Someone with authority was finally saying what Maggie had known for 20 years. The system had failed. She had been innocent. The nightmare had been real and wrong and never should have happened. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that the conviction of Margaret Ann Brennan on all counts, conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and felony murder, is hereby vacated. This court finds you fully and completely innocent. The gavel came down. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a door closing on the past. Maggie stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. 20 years of fighting, 20 years of insisting she was innocent, 20 years of carrying the weight of a crime she didn't commit. All of it lifted in the space of a single sentence. Not just released, not just freed, exonerated, declared innocent, vindicated. Mrs. Brennan, you are officially cleared of all charges. Your record will be expunged. The state of Tennessee will begin processing your compensation claim immediately. I wish you peace and healing in the years ahead. The courtroom erupted. Emma's sign waved wildly. Kate was crying, one hand on her pregnant belly. Rachel was hugging Maggie, tears streaming down her face. Henry stood in the gallery clapping with an expression of profound relief. The guilt he'd carried for 20 years finally lifting. And Maggie just stood there, feeling like she was watching it all happen to someone else, like she'd stepped outside her body and was observing from a distance. Dan pushed through the crowd, grabbed her in a hug that smelled like coffee and determination. You did it. You survived, and you won. The words unlocked something. Maggie started to cry, really cry, the kind of weeping that comes from a place so deep you didn't know it existed until it breaks open. She cried for Bobby, who died believing his wife was a murderer. She cried for the 20 years she'd lost. She cried for the sister who'd become a monster. She cried for the innocence that had been stolen and the life that could never be recovered. And she cried because it was over, finally, completely, officially over. Outside the courthouse, reporters mobbed them with questions and cameras. Rachel handled most of it, her voice strong and clear. Today, justice was finally served, 20 years late, but served nonetheless. Margaret Brennan was innocent from the beginning. Her sister's betrayal and the system's failures cost her 2 decades of freedom. But today she walks free with her name cleared and her innocence recognized. Someone shouted a question directly at Maggie. How does it feel to be exonerated? Maggie looked at Emmy on Dan's shoulders, her sign still waving. At Kate with her hand on her swollen belly, carrying new life. At Rachel who'd fought for her. At Henry who'd carried guilt and turned it into action. At the journalists and strangers and people who doubted her and people who'd believed, all of them witnessing this moment. It feels like I can breathe again. They went back to Grover's Mill in a caravan of cars, Henry and Rachel following Dan's vehicle. Kate had called ahead to the neighbors, and by the time they arrived, the Morrisons' front yard had been transformed. A banner hung across the porch. Welcome home, Margaret. Tables had been set up with food, a potluck gathered from people who wanted to celebrate justice even if they barely knew her. Former students showed up with flowers. Old teaching colleagues brought casseroles. The whole neighborhood turned out to witness the end of the nightmare. Maggie moved through it in a daze, accepting congratulations and hugs from people whose faces she barely remembered. Everyone wanted to tell her they'd always believed in her, always known she was innocent, always thought the trial was wrong. She nodded and smiled and accepted their revisionist history because correcting them would serve no purpose. Let them believe they'd been on the right side all along. Let them claim her vindication as proof of their own good judgment. What mattered was Emma pulling her toward the cake someone had brought, insisting she had to blow out the candles even though it wasn't anyone's birthday. What mattered was Henry in a quiet corner with tears in his eyes, finally forgiving himself for not doing more 20 years ago. What mattered was Rachel already making phone calls about the compensation claim, about recovering funds from Sarah's estate, about building the financial foundation for whatever came next. As the sun began to set, people started to drift away. The food was packed up, the banner taken down, the yard returning to its normal state. Dan carried a sleeping Emma inside. Kate sat on the porch with her feet up, exhausted but smiling. And Maggie stood in the front yard of the house that used to be hers, watching the sky paint itself in colors that seemed too beautiful for the ugliness that had preceded this moment. "You're free now." Rachel stood beside her, briefcase finally set down, shoulders relaxing for the first time in weeks. Really free. Not just out of prison, but legally, officially, completely innocent. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know." Maggie's answer was honest. "I never let myself think past this moment. Getting exonerated was the goal. I didn't plan for what came after." "Then maybe that's your first act of freedom." Rachel's smile was gentle, planning for what comes next, deciding what you want instead of what you've lost, building instead of recovering. "What if I don't know how?" "Then you learn, with people who care about you, with time that's finally yours, with a future that's unwritten." The compensation came through faster than expected. Tennessee expedited the process, perhaps aware that the national attention on Maggie's case made delays look bad. $400,000 deposited into a new bank account Rachel helped her set up. Not enough to replace what she'd lost, but enough to build something new. Marcus Whitfield's attorney contacted her a week later. The civil suit to recover funds from Sarah's estate had been successful. With Marcus's cooperation, they traced and frozen the offshore accounts. After legal fees and Marcus reclaiming what had been stolen from him during the marriage, there was $580,000 remaining that belonged to Maggie. The money from the house sale, the cash from her safe, Bobby's workshop equipment, the heirlooms. All of it recovered with interest. $980,000 total. Maggie stared at the bank statements, trying to comprehend wealth she'd never expected to have. She'd gone into prison middle class and comfortable. She'd come out with nothing. And now, through the twisted path of Sarah's theft and death and legal recovery, she had almost $1 million. It felt like blood money, tainted by everything it had cost to obtain. But it was also her money, earned by Bobby's carpentry and her teaching and 30 years of careful saving. Sarah had stolen it, and now it was returned. What Maggie chose to do with it would determine whether Sarah's poison continued to spread or whether something good could grow from the ugliness. Kate went into labor on a Sunday morning in early July. Dan called Maggie at 6 in the morning, his voice tight with excitement and terror. "It's time, can you watch Emma?" Maggie arrived at the hospital with Emma, who was vibrating with anticipation about becoming a big sister. They sat in the waiting room for hours, Emma coloring in a notebook, Maggie reading magazines she didn't process, both of them jumping every time a doctor or nurse walked past. Henry showed up mid-morning with coffee and bagels. Rachel arrived around noon. This strange assembled family waiting together for new life. This group of people, bound not by blood, but by choice and circumstance, and the belief that helping each other mattered. Dan emerged at 2 in the afternoon, exhausted and glowing. "Healthy baby boy. Everyone's fine. Kate did amazing. Can we see them?" Emma was already moving toward the door. In a few minutes, Dan knelt down to his daughter's level. "We named him Robert, after Grandma Maggie's husband. We thought the name deserved to live on." Maggie couldn't speak, could only nod and cry and feel her heart crack open in the best possible way. Bobby's name would continue, not erased by Sarah's cruelty, not forgotten by time, living on in this child who'd be raised by people who believed in kindness and justice, and the importance of doing right even when it cost you something. 2 days later, Maggie held baby Robert in the hospital room while Emma narrated every detail of her new brother's appearance with brutal 9-year-old honesty. "He's kind of ugly right now, but Mom says all newborns are, and he'll get cuter. He's perfect." Maggie cradled the weight of new life against her chest, felt the tiny heartbeat against hers, breathed in the smell of possibility and hope. Kate's voice was soft from the hospital bed. "You're his grandmother now. Not by blood, but by choice, if you want to be." Maggie tested the word, grandmother. It fit perfectly, settling around her like a blessing she hadn't known she was waiting for. "I'd be honored." The question of where to live couldn't be avoided forever. Maggie had been staying with the Morrisons for months now, sleeping in their guest room, eating at their table, becoming part of their family. But Kate and Dan needed that room for the baby. Emma needed to not be sharing her bathroom with a 73-year-old woman. And Maggie needed to figure out what independence looked like after 20 years of being told when to sleep, when to eat, when to exist. She started looking at houses in late July, driving around Grover's Mill with a real estate agent who treated her story with discretion and her budget with respect. Everything felt wrong. Too big or too small or too expensive or too much like trying to recreate what she'd lost. She was about to give up, maybe look at apartments in Nashville, when the agent showed her a cottage on the eastern edge of town. Small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a porch facing woods where deer came to graze at dawn, a kitchen with windows that let in morning light, a garden that needed work but had good bones. Nothing fancy, nothing grand, but something that felt possible. Something she could make hers without trying to resurrect the past. "It's 15 minutes from the Morrisons." The agent sensed her interest, close enough to help with the baby, far enough to have your own space. Maggie walked through the empty rooms, her footsteps echoing on hardwood floors that needed refinishing, stood on the porch and watched wind move through the trees. Imagined herself here, living alone but not lonely, building a life that was smaller than what she'd had but entirely her own. "I'll take it." The closing happened in August, on a Tuesday morning that felt unremarkable until Maggie signed the last paper and the lawyer handed her the keys. Kate and Dan came with her to see it that afternoon, Emma running from room to room, declaring which one would be hers when she visited. Baby Robert sleeping in Kate's arms. "This is yours," Dan said it with emphasis. "Legally, officially, no one can take it from you." The weight of that truth settled over Maggie like a blanket. Hers. Not inherited or given or stolen. Hers because she'd chosen it and paid for it with money that had been returned to her. The first thing that was completely hers in 20 years. They helped her move in over the next week. Not that she had much to move. Clothes Kate had given her, books Rachel had brought, a few pieces of furniture the Morrisons didn't need. Emma insisted on giving her the sign from the courthouse, the rainbow-lettered "Welcome Home, Grandma Maggie," that now hung above the fireplace mantel like a declaration of belonging. Maggie bought what she needed, a bed that was soft but not too soft, a couch she picked because she liked the color, dishes and towels, and the ordinary objects that make a house habitable. And she bought a frame for the photograph of Bobby she'd carried in her plastic bag from prison, placed it on the mantel beside the wooden cross and Emma's sign. The past and the present, side by side, both honored. The first night in her own home, Maggie sat on the porch and watched stars emerge as daylight faded. 73 years old, alone, starting over with nothing but money she'd earned through suffering. But free. Truly free for the first time since that September night in 2006 when Sarah had knocked on her door with tears and lies. The woods were quiet except for crickets and the distant sound of an owl. No razor wire, no guards counting heads, no cell door locking her in, just space and silence and the vast possibility of choosing what came next. She thought about Sarah, dead now, cremated, scattered in an Arizona desert that cared nothing for her story. Thought about Victor Castellano, murdered because he'd chosen his money over his mistress. Thought about Bobby, buried without her, his death a wound that would never fully heal. Thought about all the loss and waste and cruelty that had led to this moment. And then she thought about Emma calling her grandma, about baby Robert carrying Bobby's name, about Kate and Dan taking her in when they owed her nothing, about Rachel fighting for justice 20 years delayed, about Henry turning his guilt into action, about all the people who'd chosen kindness when bitterness would have been easier. Sarah had tried to teach her that love was transactional, that family was conditional, that you took what you wanted because fairness was a lie. But Sarah had been wrong. Sarah had died wrong, surrounded by wealth she'd stolen but utterly alone, unable to feel remorse or connection, or any of the things that made life worth living even when it was hard. Maggie was alone too, sitting on this porch in this cottage she owned. But she wasn't lonely, because tomorrow Emma would visit after school, because Kate would call to ask her to babysit Robert, because Rachel would check in about some legal detail, because Dan would stop by on his way home from work, just to make sure she was okay. That was the difference Sarah had never understood. Being alone and being lonely weren't the same thing. You could be surrounded by people and utterly isolated, like Sarah in her white Arizona mansion, with her dying husband who'd learned he'd married a ghost. Or you could be by yourself but connected to people who'd chosen to care about you, who showed up not because they had to but because they wanted to. The stars multiplied overhead, more visible here away from town lights. Maggie counted them like blessings, each point of light a reminder that beauty existed even in darkness, that distance didn't mean absence, that some things endured despite everything trying to extinguish them. She'd survived, more than survived. She'd refused to let Sarah's cruelty make her cruel, refused to let 20 years of injustice make her bitter, refused to believe the world was only what Sarah had shown her, transactional and cold and fundamentally untrustworthy. This cottage, this porch, this quiet evening watching deer emerge from the tree line to graze in twilight, this was her victory. Not the exoneration, though that mattered. Not the money, though that helped. The victory was this moment of peace, earned through surviving what should have destroyed her, built on the foundation of refusing to become what Sarah had been. The darkness deepened. Maggie stayed on the porch, wrapped in a blanket Kate had given her, watching the world settle into night. Tomorrow she'd plant flowers in the garden. She'd hang curtains in the kitchen. She'd continue the work of making this place hers. But tonight she just sat and breathed and existed in the freedom she'd fought 20 years to reclaim. Sarah had taken so much, but she couldn't take this. This stubborn insistence on joy despite suffering. This refusal to measure worth by what had been stolen instead of what could still be built. This quiet revolution of choosing to believe in goodness even after evil had stolen so much. The night was vast and full of possibilities, and Maggie was finally, completely, irrevocably free. The months after the exoneration settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural, like learning to walk again after years of being carried. Maggie woke each morning in her own bed, in her own house, with sunlight streaming through windows she'd chosen the curtains for. The simple act of deciding when to get up, what to eat for breakfast, whether to spend the day gardening or reading or driving into town, these small freedoms felt enormous after 20 years of scheduled existence. She planted roses in the garden, the kind her mother had loved. Marigolds and daisies too, bright spots of color against the cottage's white exterior. Her knees protested the work, but she pushed through it, finding satisfaction in dirt under her fingernails and the ache of muscles used for creation instead of mere survival. Emma helped on weekends, her small hands patting soil around seedlings, her chatter filling the quiet with questions about why flowers needed sun and whether worms had feelings, and if Grandma Maggie thought butterflies remembered being caterpillars. The girl had taken to calling her grandma without any self-consciousness now, as natural as breathing. Maggie had become a fixture in her life, babysitting twice a week while Kate recovered from childbirth and adjusted to life with a newborn. Robert was an easy baby, quick to smile, slow to cry, content to be held while Maggie read to Emma or helped with homework or made dinner in Kate's kitchen that used to be hers. Sometimes, washing dishes at that sink, Maggie would look out the window at the yard where Bobby had built a workshop, now converted to Dan's home office. The physical space remained, but its purpose had changed, adapted, become something new while still occupying the same ground. That felt like a metaphor for something, but Maggie was too tired most days to work out exactly what. Rachel visited monthly, always with the updates on cases she was working, other people fighting for exoneration, other families destroyed by the justice system's failures. She'd started using Maggie's story in her fundraising presentations, the wrongful conviction with the perfect ending, the sister's betrayal so dramatic it read like fiction. Maggie had agreed to speak at an event in October, her first public appearance since the courthouse steps, her first attempt at turning her suffering into something useful for others. The speaking terrified her more than she wanted to admit. Standing in front of strangers, telling them about Sarah's betrayal, about 20 years in prison, about Bobby dying alone, All of it felt like exposing wounds that had barely scabbed over. But Rachel insisted it mattered, that seeing Maggie, hearing her voice, understanding she was real and not just a news story, that moved people to donate, to care, to believe wrongful convictions could happen to anyone. So Maggie practiced in front of her bathroom mirror, her speech written and rewritten until the words felt smooth. She talked about trust and betrayal, about the justice system's failures, about the importance of organizations like the Innocence Project. She left out the parts that still hurt too much to say out loud. Sarah's laugh when she'd admitted framing Maggie had been easy. The coldness in her eyes when she'd said she wasn't sorry. The final letter, unrepentant to the last, choosing pride over redemption even as death closed in. Those details were for Maggie alone, locked away in the part of her heart that couldn't forgive even though she'd released the anger. Forgiveness and release weren't the same thing, she'd learned. You could let go of rage without absolving the person who'd hurt you. You could move forward without pretending the past hadn't happened. The two existed simultaneously, paradox and truth, just like bitterness and gratitude could share space in the same chest. September brought a letter from Marcus Whitfield, the first contact since the legal matters had been settled. His handwriting was still careful, doctor's precision in each letter, but something in the slant suggested exhaustion. Mrs. Brennan, I hope this letter finds you well and building the life you deserve. After everything, my wife, I still struggle with what to call her, everything Sarah stole from you. I've been seeing a therapist who specializes in betrayal trauma. Apparently discovering your spouse is a murderer living under a false identity qualifies. She's helping me understand that I'm allowed to grieve the relationship I thought I had, even though it was built on lies. That the love I felt was real, even if the person I loved wasn't. I'm writing because I found something while clearing out Sarah's belongings. A journal she kept from 2005 to 2007, the years she planned and executed Victor's murder, and your frame-up. I've read it, I wish I hadn't. The level of calculation is disturbing, but I think you have a right to see it, to understand just how long she worked on destroying you. I'm not sure if reading it will help or hurt, but it's yours if you want it. She wrote it, but it's your story she was writing about. I think about you often. Wonder if you found peace. Hope you're surrounded by people who see your worth. I know I failed you by not seeing through Sarah's performance, by giving her 7 years of comfort she bought with your suffering. I'll carry that guilt, but I'm learning it's not the same as responsibility. She fooled everyone. That was her gift. Wishing you healing, Marcus Whitfield. The author of the journal sat with Maggie for 2 weeks. She carried the letter in her pocket, pulled it out and reread it at odd moments, trying to decide if she wanted to see inside Sarah's head during those years of planning. Part of her craved the information, the complete picture of exactly how her sister had orchestrated her destruction, but another part, the part that was finally sleeping through the night, feared what reading Sarah's private thoughts might do to her fragile peace. She asked Emma about it one afternoon while they planted bulbs that would bloom in spring. If someone hurt you really bad, and then you found their diary that explained exactly why they did it, would you read it? Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to all hypothetical questions. Would it change anything? What do you mean? Like, would reading it make them unhurt you, or make them sorry, or make you feel better? Probably not. Then why would you read it? Emma patted soil around a tulip bulb. Mom says sometimes knowing more just means hurting more. Sometimes it's okay to not know everything. Your mom is very wise. I know. Emma grinned. That's why I ask her stuff instead of figuring it out myself. Maggie wrote back to Marcus that night, her response brief. Thank you for the offer, but I don't need to read Sarah's journal. I know enough. She planned to destroy me, and she succeeded for 20 years. The details of her planning won't change that or help me heal. Please do with the journal whatever you think is right. Burn it. Donate it to a criminal psychology program. Keep it. The choice is yours. I release any claim to Sarah's words. I only want her actions to stop haunting me. She mailed the letter the next morning and felt lighter for it. Another piece of Sarah's grip loosening. Another choice to move forward instead of backward. The speaking event in October was held at a Nashville hotel, a fundraising dinner for the Tennessee Innocence Project. Maggie wore a dress Kate had helped her pick out, blue like the sky on the day she'd been released from prison. Dan drove her into the city, Kate staying home with the babies but promising to watch the video Rachel would record. The ballroom was full. maybe 200 people in suits and evening wear, the kind of crowd that had money to donate and influence to wield. Maggie felt small among them, a 73-year-old woman whose story was entertainment for their charitable evening, whose suffering would be measured in dollars raised and grants written and other cases funded. But then Rachel introduced her and the room went quiet, all those powerful people turning their attention to her. And Maggie understood this was her chance to make the 20 years matter, to take the worst thing that had ever happened to her and transform it into something that might prevent the same thing happening to someone else. She told her story, the arrest, the trial, Sarah's testimony, the conviction, 20 years in prison insisting she was innocent, Bobby's death, her release, the discovery that Sarah had sold her house and stolen her savings and declared her legally dead, the confrontation in Arizona, the exoneration. She talked about what it felt like to be betrayed by the person who was supposed to love you most, to have the justice system that was supposed to protect you destroy you instead, to lose decades of your life and never get them back no matter how many judges declared you innocent. And she talked about the people who'd saved her, Kate and Dan Morrison who'd taken her in, Judge Henry Caldwell who'd never stopped questioning her conviction, Rachel Porter who'd fought for her exoneration, a 9-year-old girl named Emma who'd decided she deserved to be called Grandma. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping and it spread, became a standing ovation that embarrassed Maggie even as it validated that her story had landed, had mattered, had made these comfortable people uncomfortable enough to care. Rachel hugged her afterward, tears streaming down her face. Do you know what you just did? 3 people came up to me during dessert wanting to write major checks. That's on top of the donations we were already expecting. You just funded our operations for the next year. Maggie felt the weight of that, the strange alchemy of suffering transformed into prevention. Her 20 years buying someone else's freedom. Sarah's cruelty creating the opposite of what she'd intended, generating not destruction, but salvation. On the drive home, Dan was quiet for a long time. Then somewhere on the highway between Nashville and Grover's Mill, he spoke into the darkness. I've been thinking about your sister, about why she did what she did. The money was part of it, obviously, but I think the real motive was erasure. She didn't just want what you had. She wanted you to not exist. Declaring you dead, selling your house, taking your savings, all of it was about removing you from the world. And when you survived prison and came back, it must have destroyed her knowing she'd failed. You think that's why she was unrepentant? Because admitting regret would mean admitting you'd won? I think she couldn't afford to see you as real. Dan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. As long as you were just an obstacle, just the favored sister who'd gotten everything she deserved, she could justify anything. But if she admitted you were a person who'd loved her, who'd tried to help her, who'd suffered because of her choices, then she'd have to face what she'd become, and that was unbearable. So she chose to die unrepentant rather than face the truth. She chose pride over peace, and that's its own kind of punishment. November brought the first frost and with it a phone call from a lawyer Maggie didn't know. Her name was Jennifer Price and she represented the Castellano family. Victor's widow, Patricia, wanted to meet with Maggie. The request surprised her. Patricia had been Sarah's intended victim, the woman who was supposed to be framed for Victor's murder before her airtight alibi forced Sarah to pivot to Maggie instead. They'd never met, never spoken, their lives connected only through Sarah's web of destruction. Why does she want to meet? The lawyer's voice was professional but not unkind. She says she owes you an apology, and she has questions about Sarah that only you can answer. They met at a coffee shop in Nashville on a gray Tuesday morning. Patricia Castellano was 70 now, elegant in the way of women who'd had money long enough to wear it casually. Her hair was silver and styled, her clothes expensive but understated, her jewelry minimal. She looked like someone who'd survived something terrible and come through it with her dignity intact. Margaret. She stood when Maggie entered, extended her hand. Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I know you didn't owe me that. They ordered coffee and sat at a corner table away from the morning crowd. Patricia spent a long moment just looking at Maggie, her expression difficult to read. I followed your exoneration hearing. Read the news coverage. Listen to the audio of Sarah's confession. And I've spent the last 4 months trying to understand how I didn't see what she was. You were having an affair with her husband. Maggie said it without judgment, just stating fact. Patricia flinched but nodded. I was. For 8 months before Victor's death, we met at a charity event. He pursued me. I was lonely and flattered and stupid enough to think I was special, that he'd chosen me for some reason beyond availability. Did you know about Diana Wilson? Not until after Victor died. The insurance investigator found the policy, found her name as secondary beneficiary. At first, they thought maybe I'd set up a fake identity to collect the money after killing Victor. They investigated me hard. My alibi was the only thing that saved me. Patricia wrapped her hands around her coffee cup like she needed the warmth. When the investigation cleared, Mum, and arrested you, I felt relieved. Guilty, but relieved. Someone was being punished for Victor's death. Justice was being served. I never questioned whether you were actually guilty. I just accepted it because accepting it meant I could move on. You didn't know me. You had no reason to doubt the verdict. That's what I told myself for 20 years. Patricia's eyes were bright with unshed tears. But the truth is I could have questioned it. I could have wondered why Victor's mistress, this Diana Wilson woman, was never found or investigated properly. I could have pushed the insurance company to dig deeper before they paid out to her. I could have done a lot of things, but I was too wrapped up in my own grief and guilt to care if the right person had been convicted. The confession sat between them, heavy and complicated. Maggie understood the urge to accept easy answers, to trust the system because questioning it required energy and courage most people didn't have. Patricia was guilty of nothing more than being human, wanting closure more than truth. I went to prison for 20 years because Sarah needed a scapegoat, and I was convenient. You were supposed to be that scapegoat, but your alibi was too good. That's not your fault. That's Sarah's fault. All of it, every piece, that's on her. Patricia wiped her eyes carefully, preserving her makeup. How can you be so generous after what you lost? Because holding you responsible for Sarah's choices won't give me back those 20 years. Maggie's voice was steady. Sure. Sarah is dead. Victor is dead. Bobby is dead. The only people left are the survivors. And we can either carry Sarah's poison forward or we can choose to let it end with us. I should have fought harder to find Diana Wilson. If I'd pushed the insurance company, if I'd hired a private investigator, maybe they would have found Sarah. Maybe you wouldn't have spent 20 years in prison. Or maybe Sarah would have killed you too. Maggie said it flatly, the truth neither of them wanted to acknowledge. She murdered Victor without hesitation, framed me without remorse. If you'd gotten in her way, if you'd threatened her plan, do you really think she would have let you live? The possibility hung between them, ugly and real. Sarah had been capable of anything. That was the truth that still shocked Maggie sometimes, catching her off guard in quiet moments. Her sister, the girl she'd raised after their parents died, had been capable of murder. Not in a moment of passion, not in self-defense, but coldly, calculatingly, as a solution to a problem. Patricia reached across the table, took Maggie's hand. I can't give you back what you lost, but I want you to know that I see it. I see what Sarah took from you. And I'm sorry I was too self-absorbed to look harder at the truth 20 years ago. They talked for another hour, two women bound by the worst decision a third woman had made. Patricia told her about Victor, about the marriage that had been comfortable but not passionate, about his affairs she'd known about and ignored because divorce seemed harder than acceptance, about the guilt she'd carried for 20 years, wondering if her affair had somehow caused his death, even though logically she knew that made no sense. Maggie told her about Bobby, about the marriage that had been everything Patricia's wasn't, about loving someone so completely that losing them felt like losing a limb, about the cruelty of him dying while she sat in prison, unable to hold his hand or say goodbye or even attend his funeral. When they finally parted, Patricia pressed something into Maggie's hand, a check, made out for $50,000. I collected the life insurance after they cleared me. $2 million for Victor's death. I spent some, invested the rest. This is part of what I would have lost if Sarah had successfully framed me. It should be yours, for the time you spent paying for a crime I was supposed to have committed. Maggie tried to refuse, but Patricia wouldn't let her. Please, let me do this one thing to balance the scales even a tiny bit. The check went into Maggie's account and then out again just as quickly, donated to the Tennessee Innocence Project in Bobby's name. Rachel called the day the donation cleared, her voice thick with emotion. Margaret, do you know what this means? This funds 3 full case investigations. 3 people who might be innocent getting real legal help. Bobby would be so proud. The words landed like a blessing. Bobby would be proud, not of the money, he'd never cared much about money, but of the choice to turn suffering into salvation, to take what Sarah had stolen and transform it into something that helped instead of hurt. Winter settled over Tennessee with unusual cold, frost coating the garden every morning, the deer coming closer to the house looking for food. Maggie scattered corn for them, watched them from her kitchen window, their breath steaming in the cold air. Emma named them all, convinced she could tell them apart even though they looked identical to Maggie. That's Flower, the one with the white spot on her left ear. And that's Thumper. He's bigger than the others. And those two are the twins, even though they're probably not actually twins, but they're always together, so Emma said they counted. Christmas approached, and with it, the question of where Maggie would spend the holiday. Kate invited her to join them, of course, but Maggie hesitated. She'd been leaning on the Morrisons for months now, letting them absorb her into their family, taking their generosity without fully processing what it meant or what it cost them. They'd given her a place to stay when she had nowhere, treated her with kindness when they could have been resentful about the house she'd lost that they now owned, made her part of their family without obligation or expectation. But at some point, dependence became burden. At some point, she needed to prove she could stand on her own, build her own traditions, exist without always being the person who needed rescuing. She was trying to figure out how to say this to Kate when Emma solved it for her with a child's directness. Grandma Maggie, are you spending Christmas with us or at your house? I thought I'd stay at my house this year. Let you have family time without an extra person crowding everything. Emma's face fell. But you're family. You're my grandma. You have to be there for Christmas morning. How else will you see me open the present we got you? Compromise came in the form of Christmas Eve at Maggie's cottage and Christmas morning at the Morrisons. Emma helped her decorate, hanging lights that probably violated every safety code but looked beautiful in the darkness. They baked cookies using recipes from a cookbook Kate lent her, the kitchen filling with smells that reminded Maggie of Christmases past when Bobby was alive, and Sarah was still someone she loved instead of someone she was trying to forgive. Henry came for Christmas Eve dinner, bringing wine and stories about cases he'd presided over, justice served and justice denied in the thin line between the two. Rachel drove up from Nashville with her new girlfriend, a public defender named Sarah, which made everyone pause before they could get past the name and see the person. They ate too much and laughed too loud and stayed up past midnight talking about everything except the reason they had all come together in the first place. When everyone finally left, Maggie sat alone in her cottage with the lights still on and wrapping paper scattered across the floor and dishes piled in the sink. The mess felt good, evidence of life lived, of people gathered, of choosing joy even when sadness lived right beside it. Christmas morning at the Morrisons was chaos. Emma up at 5 demanding everyone wake to see what Santa had brought. Robert crying because the commotion scared him. Kate trying to make coffee while Dan tried to keep Emma from opening everything before anyone else was awake. And Maggie in the middle of it all, holding the baby while Emma modeled every new toy and Kate took approximately 3,000 photographs. The present Emma had mentioned turned out to be a framed photo. The whole group of them, Maggie, Kate, Dan, Emma, Henry, Rachel, even baby Robert. Taken at Maggie's exoneration, everyone crowded together on the courthouse steps, Emma's sign visible in the background. Someone had captured the moment right after the verdict, everyone crying and hugging, joy and relief written across every face. Below the photo, in careful calligraphy, someone had written, "Family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who see you at your worst and decide you're worth fighting for anyway." Maggie held the frame and couldn't speak, couldn't breathe around the emotion clogging her throat. This was what Sarah had tried to destroy. Not just Maggie's freedom or her home or her savings. Sarah had tried to destroy Maggie's capacity for this, for connection, for trust, for believing people could be good without ulterior motive, for accepting kindness without suspicion. And she'd failed. That failure, Maggie understood now, was the real victory. Not the exoneration, though that mattered. Not the money recovered, though that helped. The victory was standing in this living room and on Christmas morning, holding a baby named after her dead husband, watching a little girl who'd claimed her as grandma, surrounded by people who'd chosen her, who saw her at her most broken and decided she was worth putting back together, who fought for her when fighting was hard, who loved her when she had nothing to offer in return. Sarah had believed love was transactional, earned through performance, conditional on meeting standards. She died believing that, unable to access the thing that made life worth living even when it was hard. The thing Maggie had found in a cottage she'd bought with recovered blood money, in a family she'd been adopted into by a 9-year-old's decree, in the choice to keep believing in goodness even after evil had stolen so much. The new year came with snow, unusual for Tennessee, the whole state shutting down under 6 inches of powder. Maggie watched it from her porch, wrapped in blankets, coffee steaming in her hands. The woods were silent and white, and so beautiful it hurt to look at them. Everything covered, transformed, made new by the simple act of weather changing. She thought about Sarah buried, no, cremated, scattered in an Arizona desert that would show no sign of her passing. Thought about Victor Castellano dead for 20 years, his murder still a wound in his family. Thought about Bobby gone for 15 years, his absence still the first thing she noticed every morning. All that death, all that loss, all that cruelty and waste and tragedy. And yet, here she was, alive, free, building something new from the wreckage. Not because she was strong or brave or special, but because she'd refused to let Sarah's bitterness become hers. Refused to measure her worth by what had been stolen instead of what could still be built. Refused to accept that the world was only what Sarah had shown her. Emma appeared at the edge of the woods, pink snowsuit bright against the white, dragging a sled Dan had dug out of their garage. "Grandma Maggie, come sledding with us." And Maggie, 73 years old, 20 years stolen, 2 decades of her life gone and never coming back, set down her coffee and went. Put on boots and a coat and gloves Kate had given her. Walked through snow that came up to her shins, climbed onto a sled with a 9-year-old girl and let gravity pull them down a hill, both of them screaming with laughter, cold wind burning her face. The present moment so perfect it erased everything that had come before. At the bottom of the hill, breathless and covered in snow, Emma threw her arms around Maggie's neck. "I'm so glad you came back. I'm so glad you're here." "Me too, sweetheart." Maggie held her tight, this child who'd decided she mattered, who'd given her a title that meant belonging. "Me too." They sledded until the light started to fade, until Kate called them in for hot chocolate, until Dan carried a sleeping Robert to the car and drove them all back to Maggie's cottage, where the lights were still on and the fire she'd started that morning is still burning. This was her life now, not the life she'd had before Sarah destroyed everything, not the life she'd imagined during 20 years in prison, but this life, built from fragments and kindness and the stubborn insistence that joy was possible even after tragedy. Sarah had tried to erase her, had declared her dead and sold her home and stolen her money and her time and her husband's final moments, had built a new life on the foundation of Maggie's destruction, had died unrepentant, choosing pride over peace, believing to the last that she'd been justified in everything she'd done. But Maggie was still here, standing in her cottage doorway, watching her found family drive away, their taillights disappearing into the snowy evening. Still here, building and choosing and believing. Still here, refusing to be erased, refusing to let Sarah's cruelty define her, refusing to accept that the story ended with betrayal instead of redemption. The cold bit at her face, but she stayed outside, watching the snow fall in the lamplight, each flake unique and temporary and beautiful despite its brevity. Like moments, like people, like the choices that defined you more than the circumstances that shaped you. Inside, the fire was waiting. Tomorrow, Emma would visit after school. Next week, she'd babysit Robert while Kate went to a doctor's appointment. Next month, she'd speak at another fundraiser, her story helping others fight for freedom. Next year, who knew? Maybe nothing special. Maybe everything. Maybe just the ordinary miracle of days strung together, each one chosen, each one hers. Sarah had taken 20 years, but she couldn't take the next 20 unless Maggie let her. And Maggie was done letting Sarah take anything. She went inside, closed the door on the cold and the dark and the past, made herself dinner in the kitchen that was hers, read a book by the fire she'd built, went to bed in the room she'd decorated, slept through the night without nightmares for the first time in months, and woke the next morning to sun on fresh snow and a text from Emma. "Good morning, Grandma Maggie, love you." 3 words that changed everything. 3 words Sarah had never been able to say and mean. 3 words that proved Maggie had won not by destroying Sarah back, but by refusing to become what Sarah had been. "Love you," she texted back. "Love you too." And meant it. Not just to Emma, to all of them. To Kate and Dan and baby Robert, to Henry and Rachel, to the life she was building one day at a time, to the choice to believe in goodness even when evil had stolen so much. Sarah had taught her that love was conditional. The Morrisons had taught her it wasn't. Sarah had shown her that family would betray you. Emma had shown her that family could choose you. Sarah had tried to prove the world was cruel and cold and fundamentally untrustworthy, and everyone else had proved her wrong. That was the final accounting, the last word on Sarah's legacy. She tried to destroy Maggie and create a world where cruelty won, and kindness was weakness, and love was transactional. And she'd failed. Spring came to Tennessee with the kind of gentle insistence that made you believe in renewal, even when experience taught you that some things, once broken, stayed broken. The bulbs Maggie and Emma had planted in the fall pushed through soil still cold from winter, green shoots reaching toward a sun that grew warmer with each passing day. Daffodils first, bright yellow against the brown earth. Then tulips in reds and pinks and purples, each one a small declaration that beauty could emerge from darkness if you gave it time and tended it with care. Maggie spent her mornings in the garden, her hands remembering the work even after decades away. The arthritis in her knees made kneeling difficult, but she'd learned to work from a stool Dan had built for her, his way of helping without making her feel helpless. The roses she'd planted were budding now, tight green promises of blooms to come. Her mother had always said that roses required patience, that rushing them only damaged what was trying to grow. That felt true for more than flowers. March 14th, it marked 1 year since she'd walked out of Deborah K. Rehabilitation Center, carrying everything she owned in a plastic bag. 365 days of freedom, of learning to be Margaret Brennan again, after 20 years of being inmate, number 74329. The Morrisons insisted on celebrating what Emma had started calling Freedom Day, the anniversary treated with the same importance as birthdays and holidays. They gathered at Maggie's cottage on a Saturday afternoon, the first truly warm day of spring. Kate brought enough food to feed twice their number, still operating under the belief that love was best expressed through making sure no one ever went hungry. Dan carried Robert, now 8 months old and trying to walk, his chubby legs unsteady but determined. Emma ran ahead with a banner she'd made at school, glittery letters spelling out 1 year of being free, with drawings of butterflies and flowers and what she insisted was Maggie, even though it looked more like a stick figure with gray hair. They hung the banner across the porch and ate outside, plates balanced on laps, conversation flowing easy and comfortable. Henry arrived late with apologies and a story about a former colleague who wanted to interview Maggie for a documentary about wrongful convictions. Rachel came straight from the office, still in her work clothes, talking too fast about 3 new cases the Innocence Project was taking on, all of them helped by the funding Maggie's story had generated. This was family, Maggie thought, watching them all. Not the family she'd been born into, not the sister who'd betrayed her, or the parents who'd unintentionally planted the seeds of that betrayal through unequal love, but the family you built when the one you started with failed. The family that showed up on ordinary days and extraordinary ones. The family that chose you and kept choosing you even when you had nothing to offer but your broken self. After everyone left, after the dishes were done and the banner taken down and the cottage quiet again, Maggie sat on her porch in the evening light and thought about the year that had passed. She'd gone from having nothing to having this cottage, this garden, this life. She'd gone from being lost and alone to being surrounded by people who saw her worth. She'd gone from being a victim of Sarah's cruelty to being someone who'd survived it and was learning slowly to thrive despite it. But she'd also spent the year carrying ghosts. Bobby, dead for 15 years, but still the first person she thought of when something good happened. Still the absence she felt most keenly. Sarah, dead for 9 months, but still present in every conversation about trust and family and the ways people could hurt you. Victor Castellano, a man she'd never met but whose murder had cost her 20 years. All of them gone, all of them still shaping her present by their absence. Emma had asked her once if dead people could see you from heaven. Maggie, who wasn't sure she believed in heaven but understood the need to believe in something, had said she thought maybe they could. Emma had seemed satisfied with that answer, had said that meant her goldfish Mr. Bubbles could see her being a good big sister to Robert. And wasn't that nice? Now, sitting in the growing darkness, Maggie wondered what Bobby would see if he was watching. Would he recognize the woman she'd become, the one with gray hair and arthritic knees and 20 years of prison aging carved into her face? Would he be proud of her for surviving, for refusing to let bitterness consume her, for building this new life from the wreckage of the old one? Or would he be sad about what she'd lost, about the years they could have had together that Sarah had stolen? She liked to think he'd be proud. Bobby had always believed in moving forward, in making the best of what you had instead of mourning what you'd lost. He'd built furniture from salvaged wood, turned broken things into beautiful things, seen possibility where others saw trash. If he could see her now, she hoped he'd understand that she was doing the same thing with her life, taking what remained after Sarah's destruction and building something worth having. The invitation to speak at a national conference on wrongful convictions came in April, forwarded by Rachel with a note that said she didn't have to do it if it felt like too much, but they'd pay her expenses and it would reach thousands of people working in criminal justice reform. Maggie stared at the email for 3 days before responding. The idea of standing in front of that many people, of being examined and questioned and held up as an example, made her stomach clench with anxiety. But Rachel had been right about the first speaking event. Maggie's story moved people. It made the abstract concrete, gave faces and names to statistics about wrongful conviction rates and systemic failures. And if telling her story, reliving the worst parts of it in public, could prevent even one person from experiencing what she had, didn't she have an obligation to do it? She called Emma that evening, needing a 9-year-old's perspective on obligation and choice. Do you think I should go talk to a bunch of people about what happened to me, even though it makes me nervous? Emma considered this with her usual seriousness. Does it help people? It might. Then you should probably do it. That's what Mom says about hard things. If they help people and you can do them, you should, even if you don't want to. Your mom is very wise. I know. That's why I listen to her most of the time. Emma's grin was audible through the phone. Are you scared? A little. That's okay. Dad says brave isn't not being scared. Brave is being scared and doing it anyway. The conference was in Washington, D.C. in June, a week of panels and presentations and people who dedicated their lives to fixing a broken system. Maggie's talk was on the third day, scheduled for the afternoon session, 90 minutes including questions. Rachel flew up with her, handling logistics and providing emotional support and making sure Maggie didn't get overwhelmed by the attention. Standing backstage before her session, Maggie felt the weight of 20 years pressing on her chest. What if she couldn't do it? What if she started talking and the words wouldn't come, or she broke down crying, or people thought she was exaggerating or making herself sound better than she was? What if her story wasn't enough, wasn't important enough, wasn't helpful enough to justify dredging it all back up? Then Rachel was beside her, hand on her arm. You ready? No. Good. If you weren't nervous, I'd be worried. Nervous means you care about doing it right. Rachel squeezed her arm gently. Just tell the truth. That's all anyone needs from you. The truth of what happened and the truth of how you survived it. The auditorium was full, maybe 500 people, lawyers and activists, and formerly incarcerated people and families fighting for loved ones still locked up for crimes they didn't commit. They went quiet when Maggie walked onto the stage, all those eyes focusing on her, waiting to hear what she had to say. She told them everything. The arrest based on planted evidence, the trial where her own sister testified against her, the conviction despite her innocence. 20 years in prison maintaining that innocence while everyone, from guards to other inmates to the parole board, told her she needed to admit her guilt and show remorse. Bobby's death while she sat in a cell, unable to hold his hand or attend his funeral or say goodbye. Her release and the discovery that Sarah had stolen everything. The confrontation in Arizona and Sarah's confession without remorse. The exoneration that came 20 years too late to give her back what she'd lost. But she also told them about the people who'd saved her. Kate and Dan Morrison, who'd found her on their doorstep and taken her in instead of turning her away. Judge Henry Caldwell, who'd carried the guilt of her conviction for 20 years and turned it into action. Rachel Porter, who'd fought for her exoneration with fierce determination. A 9-year-old girl named Emma, who'd decided she deserved to be called Grandma, even though they shared no blood. And she told them what she'd learned. That wrongful conviction didn't just steal your freedom, it stole your identity, your relationships, your faith in systems that were supposed to protect you. It stole years you could never get back and created a before and after in your life that you spent forever trying to reconcile. But it couldn't steal everything unless you let it. It couldn't steal your capacity for hope or love or belief in human goodness unless you gave those things away. Sarah tried to teach me that the world was cruel and cold and fundamentally untrustworthy, that love was conditional and family would betray you, and the only way to survive was to take what you wanted without caring who you hurt. She lived and died believing that, and she was wrong. The people in my life proved her wrong every single day by choosing kindness when cruelty would have been easier, by fighting for justice when giving up would have been simpler, by loving me when I had nothing to offer in return. The applause when she finished was thunderous, sustained, people rising to their feet. But what moved Maggie more than the ovation was the line of people who waited afterward to talk to her. Lawyers who promised to work harder on their cases. Formerly incarcerated people who said her story gave them hope. Family members fighting for loved ones who said seeing her survive made them believe they could survive too. One woman, probably in her 60s, waited until everyone else had gone. She approached Maggie with tentative steps, like she wasn't sure she had the right to take up space. My daughter has been in prison for 12 years for a murder she didn't commit. Her boyfriend did it and blamed her. I've been fighting to get her case reviewed, but it's so expensive and so slow, and I'm running out of money and energy and hope. The woman's voice broke. Seeing you here, knowing you made it through 20 years and came out the other side, that's the first time I believed my daughter might have a chance. Maggie took the woman's hands in hers. What's your daughter's name? Jessica. Jessica Torres. Keep fighting for Jessica. Don't let them forget about her. Don't let them dismiss her. Keep being the person who believes her when no one else does. That's what she needs from you. Not money or lawyers or evidence, though those help. She needs to know that someone out there sees her and believes her and won't stop fighting. The woman cried then, and Maggie held her while Rachel discreetly took down Jessica Torres' information to pass along to colleagues who might be able to help. This was what turning suffering into purpose looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic victories. Just one person helping another person survive what they'd survived, paying forward the kindness that had been shown to them. Summer settled over Tennessee with weight and humidity, the kind of heat that made moving through air feel like swimming. Maggie retreated to early morning and evening for her garden work, the middle of the day too oppressive for anything but sitting in front of a fan with iced tea and a book. Emma was out of school and at the cottage most days, Kate bringing both kids while she went to doctor's appointments, or ran errands, or just needed a few hours without someone demanding her attention. Robert had learned to walk and was using his newfound mobility to investigate everything at high speed. Maggie spent most of her babysitting time following him around, removing dangerous objects from his curious hands, preventing him from eating things that weren't food. Emma helped in her 9-year-old way, which meant she mostly narrated Robert's adventures while remaining unhelpful about actually stopping him from climbing onto things he had no business climbing on. In quiet moments when Robert napped and Emma was absorbed in a book or craft project, Maggie would watch them and feel the particular ache of knowing she'd never had this with her own children. She and Bobby had tried for years before accepting that biology wasn't cooperating with their plans. They talked about adoption, but Bobby's heart condition had made agencies nervous about placing children with them. So they'd mourned the family they wouldn't have and built a life around each other instead. Now watching Emma teach Robert to stack blocks, listening to their laughter echo through her cottage, Maggie understood that family came in forms you couldn't predict. These weren't her children or grandchildren by blood, but they were hers in every way that mattered. Emma called her grandma without hesitation. Robert reached for her when he was tired or scared. Kate trusted her enough to leave her most precious things in Maggie's care. That was family. That was love. That was the thing Sarah had never understood. The thing that had cost her everything in the end. August brought news that Marcus Whitfield had remarried, a woman he'd known for years who'd helped him through the aftermath of Sarah's betrayal. The wedding announcement arrived with a note saying he hoped Maggie was well, that he donated Sarah's journal to a criminal psychology program at a university, and that he was trying to build something honest after years of living in lies. He didn't mention Sarah's name in the note. Neither did Maggie in her reply. Some ghosts were better left unacknowledged. The 1-year anniversary of Sarah's death came and went without ceremony. Maggie noted the date, June 4th, but didn't mark it in any particular way. She gardened, she babysat, she read a book Emma had recommended about dragons and friendship. She made dinner and ate it on her porch and watched the sun set through the trees. Sarah had been dead for a year, and Maggie had survived that year without her. That felt like all the acknowledgement the day deserved. September found Maggie in Grover's Mill Library, the same library where she'd spent countless hours as a teacher, helping students research papers and find books that might make them love reading. The head librarian, a woman named Dorothy who'd started working there the year before Maggie's arrest, approached her with a proposal. "We're starting a tutoring program for kids who need help with reading. Volunteers come in a few hours a week, work one-on-one with students. I thought maybe you'd be interested." The offer surprised Maggie enough that she couldn't immediately respond. Dorothy pressed on, encouraged by the lack of outright refusal. "You were one of the best English teachers this town ever had. I know that was a long time ago, but that kind of skill doesn't disappear. And these kids, they need someone who believes in them, who sees their potential even when they can't see it themselves. That's what you did for your students. That's what you could do for them. Teaching again." Maggie turned the idea over in her mind, testing it for sharp edges, for places it might cut her. She hadn't stood in front of a classroom in over 20 years, hadn't graded a paper or explained a metaphor or watched a student's face light up with understanding since before Sarah had destroyed everything. Could she do it again? Did she want to? "Let me think about it." She talked to Kate about it that evening, both of them on the Morrisons' back porch while Dan got the kids ready for bed. "Do you want to do it?" Kate asked the question without judgment, genuinely curious about Maggie's feelings rather than pushing her toward any particular answer. "I don't know. It feels like going backward, like trying to be someone I was before Sarah, before prison, before everything changed. Or it could be taking the best part of who you were and bringing it forward." Kate shifted in her chair, getting comfortable. "You love teaching. I can hear it in your voice when you talk about your old students, about the books you taught, about making kids excited about reading. Sarah took 20 years from you. Don't let her take that too." The next day, Maggie called Dorothy and said yes. She'd tutor twice a week, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, work with whoever needed help. No formal lesson plans required, just showing up and caring and helping kids believe they could learn even when learning felt impossible. Her first student was a boy named James, 10 years old, reading at a second grade level, convinced he was stupid because words didn't make sense to him the way they seemed to make sense to everyone else. He slumped in his chair across from Maggie with his arms crossed and his eyes down, radiating the particular misery of a child who'd been failed by systems that were supposed to help him. "I'm not good at reading." His voice was flat, defeated. "I'm not good at anything." Maggie heard echoes of Sarah in that statement. The belief that you were fundamentally less than, fundamentally not good enough, fundamentally undeserving. She heard the seed that, if left to grow, could become the kind of resentment that destroyed lives. "Reading is hard," she said it simply, without false encouragement. "Your brain sees letters differently than other people's brains do. That doesn't make you stupid. It makes you someone who has to work harder at reading than people whose brains work differently. But hard isn't the same as impossible." James looked up at her for the first time. "You really think I can learn?" "I know you can. I've seen lots of kids who struggled with reading learn to do it well. It takes work and patience and someone who believes in you even when you don't believe in yourself. I can be that person if you'll let me." Over the following weeks, working with James and 3 other students Dorothy assigned to her, Maggie rediscovered the particular satisfaction of teaching. The moment when something clicked for a student and their face transformed from confusion to comprehension. The slow building of confidence as someone who'd thought they couldn't learn discovered they could. The relationship that formed between teacher and student when the teacher genuinely cared about the student's success. This was purpose, she realized. Not grand or dramatic, not changing the world in visible ways, just helping a few kids learn to read, giving them tools they'd need for the rest of their lives, being the person who saw their potential and refused to give up on them. Sarah had tried to teach her that the only thing that mattered was taking what you wanted, that helping others was weakness, that love and kindness were for fools who deserved to be exploited. And every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, sitting across a library table from a struggling student, Maggie proved Sarah wrong again. October brought the second Freedom Day celebration, this one larger than the first. Kate and Dan invited people from the neighborhood, former colleagues of Maggie's who'd followed her story, members of Rachel's organization who wanted to meet the woman whose case had generated so much support. The cottage was too small to hold everyone, so they spilled out into the yard, paper plates and plastic cups, and laughter that carried across the property. Emma had made another banner, this one saying 2 years of being free, the letters even more elaborate than last year's attempt. She'd also written a speech that she insisted on reading aloud while standing on a chair so everyone could see her. 2 years ago, Grandma Maggie came home after being away for a very long time because of something bad that someone else did. She didn't have a home or money or anyone except us. But we liked her right away because she was sad but not mean about it. And now she has a home and money and lots of people who love her. And she helps kids learn to read at the library. And she speaks at places to help other people who are in jail when they shouldn't be. And she's my grandma even though we're not related by blood. And I'm glad she came home. The end. The applause for Emma's speech rivaled any Maggie had received at professional events. The girl took a bow, absolutely delighted with herself, then jumped off the chair and ran to Maggie for a hug. Did you like it? I practiced a lot. It was perfect. Maggie held her tight, this child who'd claimed her, who decided she was worth loving before she'd done anything to earn it. You're perfect. Later, after most people had left and the sun was setting and Emma was helping Kate pack up leftover food, Henry pulled Maggie aside. There was something in his expression that looked like the beginning of goodbye. I'm retiring. Really retiring this time. Moving to Florida to be near my daughter and grandchildren. I wanted to tell you before it becomes official. The news shouldn't have surprised her. Henry was 80 now, had already retired from the bench years ago, had earned the right to spend his remaining years doing whatever brought him peace. But Maggie felt the loss of it anyway. This man who'd carried the guilt of her conviction and turned it into the action that eventually freed her. You saved me. She said it plainly, needing him to know. Without you keeping my case file, without you connecting me to Rachel, without you believing something was wrong, I'd still be in prison. I'd have died there. Henry's eyes were bright. You saved me too. I spent 20 years wondering if I should have done more during your trial. If I could have stopped the jury somehow, questioned the evidence more aggressively, done something to prevent the injustice I could feel happening. Working to get you exonerated, that gave me purpose. It let me turn regret into action. You gave me that gift. They stood together in the growing darkness. Two people bound by what the justice system had done wrong and what they'd done to make it right. Eventually, Henry said goodbye, promised to stay in touch, got in his car, and drove away. Maggie watched his taillights disappear and felt the particular sadness of knowing a chapter was closing. November arrived with unexpected warmth, a last gasp of decent weather before winter settled in. Maggie spent a Saturday afternoon planting more bulbs, planning for spring blooms she'd see, but Henry wouldn't, at least not here. Emma helped, digging holes with more enthusiasm than accuracy, chattering about school and her friends, and whether she should try out for the basketball team even though she was short for her age. Do you think Aunt Sarah would have liked me? The question came out of nowhere, as Emma's questions often did, catching Maggie completely unprepared. Why do you ask? Emma shrugged. Because she was your sister and she hurt you really bad. But she was still your sister when you were little, right? When she was nice. She was my sister. Maggie chose her words carefully. When we were young, before things got complicated, she could be fun and sweet and brave. She stood up for me when other kids were mean. She made me laugh when I was sad. There were good parts of her before the bad parts took over. So she wasn't born bad? No one is born bad, sweetheart. People make choices, and sometimes they make so many bad choices in a row that they become someone very different from who they started as. Sarah made choices that hurt people. She chose to keep hurting people even when she could have stopped. Those were her choices, not something she was born with. Do you think she loved you? Even a little bit? I think she loved the idea of having a sister, but I don't think she knew how to love a real person. Real love means wanting someone to be happy, even when their happiness isn't convenient for you. It means choosing their good over your own sometimes. Sarah couldn't do that. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this with her 9-year-old wisdom. I'm glad you're not like her. I'm glad you know how to love people the real way. Me too, baby, me too. They finished planning as the sun set, both of them dirty and tired and satisfied with their work. Inside, Maggie made hot chocolate and they sat on the couch wrapped in blankets, reading one of Emma's library books together. This was love, Maggie thought. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Just showing up, being present, choosing each other day after day. December brought Christmas preparations, and with them, the question of what Maggie wanted for the future. She'd been living in the cottage for over a year now, had built a life that worked, had found purpose in tutoring and speaking and being part of the Morrison family. But was this it? Was this the rest of her life? Wake up, garden, tutor, babysit, go to bed, repeat until she died? The question wasn't dissatisfaction exactly, more like curiosity about what else might be possible. She was 74 now, but healthy enough. Still sharp mentally despite what prison had tried to do to her mind. Still capable of learning new things, meeting new people, building new parts of her life if she wanted to. She asked Rachel about it when she came to visit in mid-December. What do people do when they retire? Rachel laughed. You're asking me? I'm 32. I have no idea what retirement looks like. You know what I mean. What do people do when they have time and money and no obligations? When they can choose anything? What do you want to do? That's the problem. I don't know. I never got to think about it before. Bobby and I were going to travel when he retired, see all the places we'd only read about. But that was our dream together. I don't know what my dream is just for me. So figure it out. Rachel said it like it was simple. You have time, you have resources, you have people who support you. Try things. See what feels good. Maybe you hate it all and decide tutoring and babysitting is exactly what you want. Or maybe you discover something new that makes you excited to wake up in the morning. The conversation stayed with Maggie through Christmas, through New Year's, into the cold months of early winter. She started paying attention to what interested her, found herself drawn to documentaries about national parks, spent time reading travel books about places Bobby had wanted to see, looked at photographs of mountains and deserts and coastlines and felt something stir that might have been longing. On March 14th, her second Freedom Day, surrounded by family and friends and the life she'd built, Maggie made an announcement. I'm going to take a trip. Nothing crazy, just a week or two. I want to see the Grand Canyon. Bobby always wanted to go, and we never made it. I think I need to see it for both of us. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Kate volunteered to watch the cottage. Emma insisted on helping plan the route. Dan downloaded maps and travel guides. Rachel found a small group tour that would handle logistics while still giving Maggie independence. Within a week, it was booked. April departure, 8 days in Arizona, the Grand Canyon, and several national parks, returning before Emma's spring break so they could still do their annual tradition of baking cookies and watching movies. The night before she left, Maggie sat on her porch with the letter Sarah had left, the final words her sister had written. She'd read it only once the day it arrived, but she'd kept it. Not because she needed to remember Sarah's lack of remorse, but because destroying it felt like pretending it hadn't happened. Now she read it again under the porch light, Sarah's handwriting as beautiful and false as everything else about her. I'm not sorry. I did love you once. That girl died. Hope freedom tastes sweeter than I imagine. Maggie folded the letter carefully and put it in an envelope with Bobby's photograph and her mother's cross, all the artifacts of her past that she'd carried through prison and beyond. Then she packed them in her suitcase, not to obsess over, but to take with her, to show Bobby the Grand Canyon through a photograph, to let Sarah see that yes, freedom did taste sweet, sweeter than Sarah could have ever imagined, because Maggie had learned what Sarah never could. That joy didn't require taking from others. That love wasn't transactional. That surviving cruelty without becoming cruel was its own quiet revolution. Arizona in April was beautiful. The desert in bloom, temperatures perfect for hiking. The tour group was small, mostly retirees like Maggie, people who worked hard and were now claiming time for themselves. She told them she was a retired teacher, which was true enough. Didn't mention the 20 years in between teaching and retirement. That was her story to tell or not tell as she chose. Standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, looking out at geology carved by water and time into something impossibly beautiful, Maggie thought about Bobby, about the trips they'd planned and never taken, about the life they'd built and lost, about how much he'd loved her and how completely Sarah had stolen him from her. But she also thought about Emma and Robert and Kate and Dan and Henry and Rachel and all the people who'd built the new life with her. About James at the library who'd just read his first chapter book and cried with pride. About Jessica Torres' mother who'd called to say the Innocence Project was taking her daughter's case. About all the ways Sarah had tried to destroy her that had failed because Maggie had refused to be destroyed. She pulled out her phone and texted Emma, "At the Grand Canyon. It's beautiful. Wish you could see it." The response came back immediately. "Take lots of pictures. Love you, Grandma Maggie." Standing at the rim of something vast and ancient and indifferent to human suffering, Maggie felt herself smile. This was victory, not the exoneration or the money or the life rebuilt. The victory was this moment right here, standing in a place Bobby had wanted to see, sharing it with him through memory, texting a 9-year-old girl who loved her, planning to go home to a cottage she owned and a life she'd chosen and people who'd claimed her as family. Sarah had tried to teach her that the world was cruel, that family would betray you, that love was conditional and kindness was weakness, and the only way to survive was to take what you wanted without caring who you hurt. And everyone else had proved her wrong. The Morrisons, who'd taken in a stranger. Henry, who'd turned guilt into action. Rachel, who'd fought for justice. Emma, who'd decided Maggie was worth loving. Patricia Castellano, who'd faced her own guilt and tried to make amends. Marcus Whitfield, who'd chosen to help despite his pain. James and the other students at the library who trusted her to teach them. All of them proving that goodness existed, that people could choose kindness, that love didn't require blood or obligation, just the willingness to see someone's worth and act accordingly. That was Sarah's real failure. Not that she'd been caught or died unrepentant or lost the 20 years she'd stolen. Her failure was that she'd died believing her cynical view of the world was correct, never understanding that she'd created the cruelty she'd claimed to see. She'd died isolated and alone in a house full of stolen wealth, unable to access the thing that made life worth living even when it was hard. Maggie had that thing. She had it in abundance. She had it overflowing. She stayed at the canyon until sunset painted the rocks in colors that didn't seem possible in nature. Oranges and reds, and purples that shifted as the light changed. Other tourists took photographs and exclaimed over the beauty. Maggie just stood and breathed and existed in a moment that was completely hers. No one counting time. No one telling her when to move. No one limiting her freedom or her joy or her capacity to choose what came next. That night, back in her hotel room, she called Kate. "How's the trip?" Kate's voice was warm with genuine interest. "Beautiful. Perfect. Exactly what I needed." Maggie lay on the hotel bed, comfortable and content, and already planning her next trip. Maybe Yellowstone in summer, maybe the coast of Maine, maybe somewhere Bobby had never mentioned, somewhere entirely hers. "Thank you for encouraging me to go. Thank you for coming back." Kate said it seriously without qualification. "For coming back to life, for letting us be part of it, for being Emma's grandmother and Robert's grandmother and our family even though you didn't have to be." "I didn't have to be, but I chose to be." That's the difference, isn't it? Sarah couldn't choose anything except what benefited her. But I can choose this. Choose you. Choose love even when it's complicated or inconvenient or costs me something. That's what makes it real. After they hung up, Maggie sat with that realization. She'd spent 2 years processing what Sarah had done to her, understanding the why of it, coming to terms with a betrayal so profound it had reshaped her entire life. But she'd spent less time acknowledging what she'd done in response to that betrayal. She'd chosen to survive, chosen to trust Kate and Dan when trusting felt impossible, chosen to accept Henry's help and Rachel's advocacy, chosen to love Emma without holding back, chosen, over and over again, to believe in goodness even when evil had stolen so much. Those were her choices, her agency, her refusal to let Sarah's cruelty define her. That was the victory Sarah could never take away. The rest of the trip passed in a blur of natural beauty and quiet contemplation. Maggie hiked trails her knees protested but completed anyway. Watched sunrises and sunsets from viewpoints that made her feel small in the best way. Talked to other tourists about their lives and their travels and the places they'd been and the places they still wanted to go. Felt herself existing in the world as Margaret Brennan, not as Sarah's victim or the wrongfully convicted or the exonerated, just as herself. On the flight home, she looked out the window at the country passing beneath her. Arizona giving way to New Mexico, to Texas to Tennessee, the landscape changing but the continuity remaining. Her whole life was down there somewhere. The house she'd lost and the cottage she'd found, the prison where she'd spent 20 years, and the library where she taught kids to read, the Morrison family who'd saved her, and the scattered friends who'd stood by her. All of it connected, all of it part of the same story, the story of surviving what should have destroyed her. Dan met Hare at the airport, Emma bouncing beside him with a sign that said, "Welcome home, Grandma," the exclamation point carefully drawn. Robert in a stroller, babbling welcome home nonsense that made everyone nearby smile. They drove back to Grover's Mill through spring evening light, Emma chattering about everything Maggie had missed in 8 days, which according to Emma was approximately everything important that had ever happened. The cottage was exactly as she'd left it, Kate having tended the garden and collected the mail and made sure everything was ready for her return. Maggie walked through her small home, touching familiar surfaces, settling back into the space she'd created. Tomorrow she'd unpack properly and do laundry and call Henry in Florida and get back to her tutoring schedule. But tonight she just wanted to be here, in this place that was hers, having returned from a trip she'd chosen to take, living a life Sarah had tried to prevent. She made herself dinner and ate it on the porch, watching the sun set through the trees. The deer appeared at the edge of the woods, the same ones that came every evening. Or maybe their descendants, she couldn't tell. Emma would know. Emma could tell them all apart. Emma saw details Maggie missed, connections Maggie overlooked, possibilities Maggie had stopped imagining until a 9-year-old decided she was worth believing in. The stars came out one by one, the same stars that had been above her in Arizona, the same stars that had been above her in prison, the same stars that would be above her tomorrow and next year, and for whatever time she had left. Sarah was dust now, scattered in a desert that cared nothing for her story. Victor Castellano was bones in a grave, his murder still a wound in his family's history. Bobby was memory and photographs, and a baby boy named after him who would carry his name into a future Bobby would never see. But Maggie was here, alive, free, building and choosing and loving and believing that the world could be good even when people did terrible things to each other. She was here, and that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. 2 years since walking out of prison, 2 years of learning to be human again, to trust again, to hope again, 2 years of proving that Sarah's cruelty didn't have to win, that betrayal didn't have to breed bitterness, that you could survive the worst thing you could imagine and still find reasons to get up in the morning. Her phone buzzed with a text. "Emma, good night, Grandma Maggie. I'm glad you're home. Love you to the moon and back." She typed her response carefully, meaning every word. "Love you too, sweetheart. See you tomorrow." Tomorrow. That was the gift, she realized. Not the past rewritten, or the loss recovered, or the time returned. Just tomorrow. And the day after that. And all the days strung together, each one chosen, each one hers, each one proof that Sarah had failed in her attempt to erase her. Maggie Brennan was still here, building a life worth living, surrounded by people worth loving, believing in goodness worth fighting for. And that was enough. That was everything. That was more than Sarah's bitterness could ever take away.